Across the world, the wind keeps a kind of ledger. It combs deserts where bleached gravel gives way to lonely monoliths, it hisses through jungles that have swallowed stairways, it crosses high plains where walls wander like fossilized rivers. In those places, the remains of extraordinary ancient achievements endure, towering megaliths, massive terraces, and tombs vast enough to feel like weather. Their blocks weigh hundreds, sometimes thousands of tons, and the faces of those stones, cut square, beveled, or interlocked like puzzles, still command respect centuries and millennia after their builders went quiet. We can measure the angles, count the courses, even replicate some methods in careful experiments, but the full choreography of how and why is often missing. The people who made them left few names. The purposes blur at the edges. The techniques, in many cases, read like a language we can sound out but no longer speak. That uncertainty unsettles our tidy timelines. In some regions, the masonry seems older than the cultures we usually credit with engineering bravado. In others, the style is so unlike its neighbors that it feels like a visitor from a different school of thought. And wherever we go, we keep meeting the same uneasy pair of questions. Who were the hands? What were they trying to say? There is, though, a second voice that threads through this silence. It comes from stories, very old ones, told at hearths and in temples long after their first tellers were dust. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh, where a god-sent deluge scrubs the world, to the Hopi traditions of North America that speak of waters rising after human error, from ancient Chinese accounts of overwhelming floods that forced the land to be reshaped, to Aboriginal Australian songlines remembering the sea's advance across once dry country, the theme recurs. Oceans apart, with no chance to compare notes, distant cultures kept a memory of the world remade by water. What are we supposed to do with that chorus? Some researchers hold that these echoes recall real events near the end of the last ice age, sea levels rising in steps rather than smooth slopes, coastlines redrawn between about 12 and 8,000 years ago, populations pushed inland as familiar ground vanished. Others point out that plenty of traditions, including the biblical timeline, set their flood far later, around the 23rd century BC, too recent, perhaps, to be tied to glacial retreat and more suggestive of a catastrophic, regional trauma that felt universal to those who endured it. If that later date were right, it hints at something sharp rather than slow, a blow that could cost entire communities their memory and their maps. It's here that the stones and the stories begin to overlap in a way that is hard to ignore. Around the world, megaliths share familiar habits of mind, blocks so large they frighten the imagination, joints shaved to near-perfect contact, surfaces that look simple until you notice the subtle curves and dovetails, alignments that catch light or shadow on days the sky keeps. In Peru and the Levant, in Japan and Ireland, in Turkey and the American Midwest, we see structures that seem to agree on certain principles despite the oceans between them. It doesn't prove a single plan. Convergence happens when people everywhere work with gravity, daylight, and the materials at hand. But those rhymes across distance invite a question most of us cannot help asking: were these cultures speaking to the same problems, or faintly to each other? The risk, of course, is romance. A neat narrative about a lost worldwide civilization can be more delightful than the patient mess of archaeology. But romance is not the same as curiosity. Curiosity makes room for both hard evidence and honest doubt, it keeps the wonder, but it also keeps the numbers. So that is how we will travel, attentive to what is known, gentle with what is suspected, and open to the possibility that our ancestors' imaginations and disciplines were far richer than we default to believing. As we move through this story, we'll treat these places as more than ruins. The stones are arguments, about stability, about ceremony, about time. They bear traces, of tools and quarry routes, of labor organized across seasons, of ritual agendas written in alignments only the sky can keep, of myth laid like a second foundation under everything. Some sites will feel like puzzles whose last pieces fell into the sea. Others will feel like finished thoughts. Many will remain stubbornly themselves, resisting the tidy answers we crave. Before we step into the field, consider how we listen. In many of the cultures we'll visit, knowledge traveled by mouth, song, and practice rather than ink. Oral memory is not a ledger you can audit, but neither is it a fairy tale warehouse. It compresses, exaggerates, edits for survival, yet it often remembers the shape of a thing long after dates have slipped. When dozens of such memories rhyme with geological and archaeological hints, caution and attention should both increase. We will try to let different kinds of evidence talk to each other, and we will admit when they refuse. There is one more thread, the difference between technique and purpose. Moving a 100-ton block is a technical problem. Deciding it must be moved at all is cultural. What made a community pour generations of attention into a circle, a platform, a passage aligned to a winter sunrise? Calendars matter for crops, processions matter for belonging, tombs matter for the way the living think about the dead. And sometimes, monuments are at once practical and poetic, bridges between the necessary and the beautiful. If we can't always reconstruct the machines, we can still try to reconstruct the meanings. If you're watching, the pictures will help: tool marks, distant quarries, a sunbeam landing exactly where it should on a once-a-year morning. But you don't have to watch. Like the sites themselves, this is built to be walked by ear. Close your eyes if you like. Let the outside world fade. Time, in here, will slow down to the pace of stone. We'll begin in a place guidebooks often skip, though it deserves to sit beside the better-known titans. In the wooded hills of Japan, two carvings wait, one that appears to float, another shaped like a ship that belongs to no sea. Their granite faces are smooth in a way that confuses chronology, their angles are so deliberate they feel like someone's untranslatable grammar. Around them, local legends speak in a voice as old as the cedars, of beings who came down, of knowledge that arrived and then withdrew, of a flood that rewrote the map. Whether you read those stories as history, metaphor, or both, they place the stones inside a human world of fear, memory, and reverence. And they remind us that our ancestors didn't simply survive their environments, they argued with them, carved into them, and asked them to answer back. From there, we will cross the high air of the Andes, where walls move like rivers and corners behave like logic problems. We'll dive a little way into the Mediterranean to find blocks now grazed by fish. We'll stand in a field of basalt circles that only the morning solstice can solve. We'll trace a razor-straight split in Saudi sandstone and listen to the petroglyphs beside it. We'll descend into an Egyptian chamber that feels older than the frescoes above. We'll walk two passages on opposite edges of Europe that capture the sun on appointed days. We'll test the arithmetic of hauling stones the size of buses in the Bekaa Valley. We'll climb earthen serpents and city mounds that are as precise as any plumb line. We'll circle funerary towers on a high Peruvian lake, count tool-marked grooves in Chinese caves, and finally step among pillars 12,000 years old that were raised, used, and then buried with eerie care. What waits at the end will not be a verdict. It will be a set of better questions, about what it takes to remember, what it costs to forget, and how much we still underestimate the people who faced the same sky we do and built in its image. If we're careful, we might even hear what they were trying to say, not in words, but in the way light finds a lined stone at exactly the right moment, the way a joint refuses to admit a blade of grass, the way a ruin still feels like a promise. Ready? We start in Japan, where a granite colossus seems to hover, and where the first riddle in our journey turns out to be not how it was made, but what kind of mind required it. In the cedar shade of Hyogo's low hills, a stone seems to hover. You round a shrine path and there it is, Ishino Hoden, a granite mass big as a cottage, poised above a pool so still it behaves like polished obsidian. Water laps a concealed pedestal in the center, and that trick of reflection makes the megalith appear to float, as though someone pressed pause on gravity. The closer you get, the stranger it becomes. The faces are unervingly clean, planes that catch light like the facets of a cut gem, corners that look solved rather than carved. The numbers, for once, don't deflate the awe, they deepen it. Roughly 6.5 meters long, nearly 6 wide, and a little over 5 tall, the stone is estimated at around 500 tons, 3 jumbo jets worth of stubborn earth lifted into a poised breath. It is balanced with a confidence that feels like ceremony. There is no plaque that gives you the answer key. No maker's inscription, no neat dedication to a patron or a deity. Local tradition supplies a story because stories are what people make when engineering disappears into the past. The tale says the gods did it, descended, shaped, and left. Another version credits beings with tools that could turn stone soft, so that a mountain could be coaxed, not hammered, into form. You can snort at that if you like, or you can stand long enough to notice the silence Ishino-Hoden creates around itself, the way its deliberate geometry contradicts the hillside's randomness until the hillside feels, for a moment, deliberate too. There are earthly possibilities, and they don't break the spell. The pool that makes the stone float is part illusionist, part archivist. It disguises the central support, but it also keeps the surfaces damp and dark, slowing weather's teeth. Tooling marks, where they survive, suggest a careful, staged reduction rather than brute force, stone taken away a plane at a time like a sculptor refusing to rush. Perhaps it was an unfinished commission, a monument meant to be freed from the bedrock and never was. Perhaps the floating was the point, a ritual machine for making mass look weightless, a lesson in what devotion could accomplish. Or perhaps it was a test piece in a quarry landscape that we no longer read as quarry because the other grammar has been erased by centuries of use and leaf litter. Drive east into Nara Prefecture, and the mood shifts from mountain hush to an archaeological whisper that runs through the entire Osaka countryside. That landscape is full of puzzles, keyhole tombs softened by moss, unusual stone platforms, and boulders with faces a mason would recognize but a modern visitor keeps reading as myth. On a low rise in this ritual topography sits Masuda no Iwafian, the rock ship of Masuda. It is not a ship in any literal sense, but the name holds because the thing looks like a vessel run aground on an ocean of rice fields. 11 meters long, 8 wide, nearly 5 tall, a single, enormous block cut flat on top as if to host the sky, with shallow rectangular sockets and a central groove that runs like a measured thought. The craftsmanship is lucid, symmetry that resists vanity, a precision that feels more like counting than decoration. No one agrees on its exact job description. Some argue those sockets once anchored timbers or devices now lost, others see it as a survey platform laid out to sight lines we no longer know how to read, an instrument for mapping land or sky before maps were parchment. An astronomical hypothesis gets floated almost automatically around a stone with a groove and a horizon line, perhaps it registered solstice or equinox light, a megastone dial calibrating the year for people whose hunger could not afford a miscounted season. There is also the more prosaic possibility, the kind archaeology often rediscovers after we've told ourselves 100 thrilling stories, that this was a stage in a tomb's construction or a block prepared to be split and reused, the sockets the clues to a technique rather than a ceremony. What about the debris, the trail of chips and shards you expect to see after work like this? Much is made of their absence. But centuries of farming will tidy a landscape better than any site crew. Stones become field borders, footings, steps, memories. In a place that has been continuously inhabited since the first capitals rose here, clean ground is not an anomaly, it is evidence of long use. What's more, Osaka's stoneworking tradition is not a ghost story. Nearby lie other carved anomalies, Sakafunishi with its basins and runs, the great capstones of Ishibutai Kofun, each giving the same impression of a culture that could think in stone fluently, shaping it for water, for dead, for spectacle. Even so, folklore persists, as it should, because it carries what measurements can't. The region's old tales speak of visitors from across the sea or out of the sky, teachers who arrived with knowledge, of medicine, farming, star-watching, building, and then withdrew after catastrophe. Sometimes the catastrophe is a flood, a great surge that scoured the lowlands and forced culture uphill. Japan keeps these kinds of memories in more than one cupboard. The 8th century Kojiki is full of gods whose tempers remake the land, and later chronicles remember inundations that changed borders and plans. If you step back from the specifics and simply listen for tone, the stories in Hyogo and Nara pluck the same string as other old stories do from other parts of the world. Something powerful came, something powerful left, we live in the eddies of that going. To honor the myth is not to abandon the evidence. It is to let the two look at one another. In the case of Ishino-Hoden and Masuda no Iwafian, the cultural context does a lot of the talking. This is a landscape where the sacred is not only enclosed by architecture but embedded in it. Shinto understands rock as a possible seat for a kami. A boulder is not raw material by default, it is a presence. Buddhism arrived in the Asaka period and braided its own ritual needs into the terrain, producing an age of building that could be both technically shrewd and spiritually ambitious. If you were a mason then, you might be asked to make time physical, to carve a place where the first light of a certain day does something exact, to cut a block that makes the invisible feel held. If your client was a clan aiming to stake cosmic legitimacy on a hill, you might be ordered to prove, in stone and in public, that their calendar matched heaven's pulse. Stand on Masuda no Iwafune at dusk and the fields turn into a chart, the ridgelines mark bearings, the sun runs its rehearsed path, the groove collects shadow with metronomic grace. Stand by the pool at Ishino Hoden and watch how the wind muzzles when it reaches the water, how the reflection builds a machine for seeing that alters the mass above it. Whatever else these carvings did, they choreographed attention. They asked people to gather, to witness something that happens only when stone and sky keep an appointment. The difficulty of the carving was not waste, it was a proof offered to the community that effort had been converted to meaning. The temptation, always, is to stitch these resemblances, here and elsewhere, into a single lost fabric. Granite that floats in Japan, rock ship, with sockets and a groove, polygonal walls in Peru, footings in the Levant grazed by fish, surely someone taught someone, or someone survived a disaster and carried a kit of ideas across oceans. Maybe. Or maybe similar needs, similar materials, and similar human appetites for awe produce designs that rhyme. Stone resists. Sky repeats. Every society that has both will eventually try to lock them together so that time can be felt, not just counted. We will not force these Japanese riddles to solve more than they can bear. It is enough, for now, to register how they behave on the senses and the mind, how weight can be made to seem weightless, how a carved block can catch the years turning, how the absence of a tool catalog can make technique feel like magic without requiring it to be. The unknown builder is not an indictment of history, sometimes it is a gift, a blank we fill with more careful questions. As we leave the cedars and the shrine bells and the mirror-black water, carry forward a way of looking rather than a conclusion. Follow the groove across the top of the rock ship until it points you beyond the paddies, over ocean and rainforest and desert, to a place where stone does not pretend to float but to flow, up a hill of Andean bedrock where walls keep the shape of rivers and corners seem to have learned how to think. You reach it by climbing into thinner air above Cusco, where the city's red roofs spill like broken pottery across a valley and the hills turn the color of old coins. On the ridge, the first thing you notice is not a single wall but a gesture, 3 great zigzags stepping across the slope, tiers of stone that look like the teeth of a giant key. This is Sacsayhuaman, citadel, temple, storeroom of the sun, or all of those at once, raised from blocks so large you mistake them for outcrops until you notice the seams. Stand close and the geometry takes you captive. The faces are dressed smooth, edges meet like thought meeting thought, each stone has learned the shape of its neighbor's refusal. There is no mortar. There never was. And yet a blade of grass can't live in the joints. People quote weights here the way sailors quote winds. Some of these blocks run to dozens of tons, a handful push into the low hundreds, a few are estimated at around 200 tons or more, the kind of numbers that make you reevaluate what a wall can be. The stones are not rectangles stacked like books. Many are pentagons, dodecagons, wild, deliberate polygons with as many as a dozen faces trimmed to agree with the next stone's awkward logic. The lines of the wall refuse to go straight for long. They bend and sweep as if obeying a current, turning fortification into choreography. Try to slide paper between 2 blocks and you will find, with a small jolt of embarrassment, that the old cliché is true. Engineers and archaeologists can give you parts of the method. Beds of earth tamped hard as a drum. Ramps braided of soil and stone. Cables of plaited fiber, levers of wood harder than your knuckles, teams trained to heave together so that momentum becomes one more tool. Rough shaping at quarries, then finer work once a block arrived, raised, lowered, raised again, until it settled into its permanent quarrel with gravity. But when you ask for the full film, how a 200-ton stone crossed ravine and ridge, turned, settled, and leaned its face against its mate without shattering, their sentences lengthen with cautions. The Inca state could command labor in astonishing numbers, the mountain seasons could cooperate, the route could be coaxed, and still the last few centimeters feel like a magic trick done slowly enough to be legal. Local memory offers other scripts because it must. Some stories speak of giants who moved stone the way a child moves stools. Others whisper about songs that softened rock, or a sap that turned hard faces malleable for an hour, letting a block be persuaded rather than forced. The modern ear hears allegory, about organization that behaves like strength, about patience that behaves like sorcery. And yet when you run your fingers along the cool seam between two stones, when you see the slight convexity that locks one into the next like a ball and socket, you understand why people reached for myth. Craft this accurate can feel like bending the rules rather than obeying them. A larger pattern coils around the masonry. Cusco, in some traditions, was laid out in the shape of a puma. Sacsayhuaman formed the head and its zigzag walls the animal's teeth. Whether or not city planning followed that plan literally, the metaphor describes the mood perfectly. This place is a mouth, and the stones bite sky. From here you command the whole bowl of the valley. Watch the weather march in on long legs. Hear the city hum several hundred meters below. If you wanted a place to stage power, a ritual to nail the sun to its course, a festival to declare the empire's pulse healthy, you would choose this apron of high ground where earth and air act like amplifiers. To this day, every winter solstice, the reenactment of Inti Raymi floods the terraces with color and breath, a reminder that in the Andes statecraft and ceremony were twins. Sacsayhuaman is a survivor, but a wounded one. When the Spanish took Cusco, they treated this place like a quarry already sorted by genius. For centuries, blocks smaller and handier than these monsters were prized out and trundled downhill to become lintels and corners in churches, monasteries, houses. What remains, these great teeth, persist because they are too large to steal without announcing your theft to the sky. Even injured, the walls keep their lesson. In 1650 and again in later earthquakes, when much of Cusco cracked, the interlocking courses here shrugged and settled. It turns out that geometry is a kind of mercy. Stones that refuse to slide also refuse to collapse. The puzzle of where the largest blocks began their lives and how far they traveled is part of the site's magnetism. Quarries near and far bear scars that look like negative impressions of these megaliths. Tool marks suggest roughing at source, then polishing after fit. You can picture the choreography in seasons, dry months when earth is solid and rivers are fordable, teams fed by granaries that the state kept like beating hearts, routes laid out along ridgelines to avoid the treachery of the valley floors. None of this collapses the mystery. It simply replaces one kind with another, not, how could they, but, what did it take to want this enough to organize a continent's attention? Touch the wall and you feel the skin of a system. Empire runs through it, the labor tax that brought hands from across the Andes, the hierarchy of officials who tallied those hands and kept them fed, the engineers who learned to read rock and weather, the masons who could hear, in a tap of a hammerstone, whether a flaw was hiding in the heart of a block. Ritual runs through it, alignments that may have doubled as calendars, processional routes that convert an army into a prayer, sightlines that tether sky to stone on long-remembered days. And pragmatism runs through it, batters and offsets that give the wall stance, drainages that escort rain down and away, margins left proud so the masons could adjust a contact without losing a face. Stand long enough and a strange thing happens, the stones cease to be large. Scale drains away and the surface becomes all detail, lichen like green punctuation, hairline scars where a tool skittered, faint discolorations where water has licked a vein of different mineral for centuries. You begin to see it not as a miracle but as the patient sum of choices, this edge slightly convex to meet that concavity, this corner eased so it won't chip the day a tremor comes, this recess tucked just out of sight so the block can be gripped again if the fit needs a whisper more. Craft becomes a theology of attention. And still, even after the details have done their soothing work, something untidy remains. The curve of a tear catches late light and the wall looks for a moment as if it is flowing uphill. A stone as high as your chest meets one the size of a bus with such sympathy that both seem to soften. You remember the folktales about songs and saps and giants, and you understand them as perfectly rational ways to tell the truth that most of us have forgotten how to feel, that intelligence, multiplied by time and organized by belief, can make matter do obedient, improbable things. On the walk back down, the city grows again in your field of view, tile, smoke, a scatter of horns. You pass the scars of where lesser blocks were harvested, places where the wall's grammar has broken mid-sentence. You think about the stubbornness of materials and the stubbornness of meaning. Even robbed and weathered, Sacsayhuaman keeps arguing that stone can be made to behave like intention, and that intention, if you layer enough bodies and days under it, can acquire the weight of geology. Ahead, the sacred valley opens like a corridor. A few hours' travel along it waits another lesson in Andean stone, a terraced town cradled by mountains, a wall of 6 monoliths that look like a paused procession, and a quarry glaring down from across a river as if daring you to remember how the blocks came. We go there next, where the puzzle adds a river crossing to its list of conditions and where the stones, pink in certain light, seem to keep their own counsel. The sacred valley squeezes itself into a gorge at Ollantaytambo, as if the mountains are practicing how to close a door. Terraces climb the slopes in careful ribs, and above the town, whose streets still keep the Inca grid, you see a wall that looks less like a wall than a held breath. 6 great slabs stand in a row, separated by slim inset stones like bookmarks, their faces pink in certain light. People call it the Wall of the 6 Monoliths, part of a temple precinct that the Spanish found half-finished and hurried to plunder for building stone. From the plaza it seems a modest thing, a long parapet on a high platform. Stand beneath it, though, and each slab feels like a stalled procession, individual, massive, oddly alive. The monoliths aren't granite, as guidebooks sometimes say in passing. They are a reddish volcanic rhyolite, often described as porphyry, quarried across the river from the Cachicota slopes. You can still walk the quarry road, a scar that winds down the mountain and then disappears at the Urubamba's edge as if into a problem the ancients had already solved. Some of the blocks here weigh on the order of 50 tons, others a little less, others more. Each carries clues to its making, faint pecking marks like constellations, shallow bosses that might have served as grips or simply as scars left by the tools that bit and withdrew, and seem so tight your fingertips notice what your eyes doubt. The puzzle is not only mass. It's geography. The quarry sits roughly 7 kilometers away by the routes the ground allows, the river between like a moving line drawn by a strict teacher. How do you drag a stone the size of a bus down a steep slope without letting it outrun you? How do you cross a river that spends half the year behaving like an argument? How do you then climb the opposite bank and rise to this platform without tearing your machine, or your workforce, apart? Answers exist, but none of them are easy, and none of them alone feel sufficient. Dry season windows matter, the river drops and exposes shingle bars that behave almost like roads. The Inca were geniuses of temporary solutions, earthen ramps that appear and vanish on command, causeways of cribbed stone filled with rubble, reed and fiber bridges strong enough for armies, renewed ritual by ritual each year. A 50-ton block will not consent to a hanging bridge, but the logic that builds one will very happily build a trestle, a low crossing, or a diversion's coffer dam. Sledges on greased or watered clay do more than you think. Rollers work until terrain refuses them, then wet sand or a bed of rounded cobbles turns friction into a fraction. Ropes of plaited ichu grass can pull like patient rivers when you give them enough shoulders. When a slope steepens, a stone can be gentled down not only by breaking ropes and posts but by the route itself, long switchbacks that convert altitude into distance and dread into arithmetic. The landscape keeps the receipts. Along the way from Cachicota lie the piedras cansadas, the tired stones, huge blocks abandoned mid-journey, as if a deadline or a war or a season shift called the workforce elsewhere and the stones were left catching their breath. On the mountain you can still see half-born monoliths, detached on 3 sides from their beds and waiting for the last undercut. Nearby lie quarry platforms and cut lanes where sledges could be coaxed into the path and turned without breaking their backs. Above town, on the opposite slope at Pinquiluna, you can climb to long, stone-walled storehouses, colossus, perched to catch the cool wind. Grain from the sacred valley floor rested there in ventilated rooms, insurance for an empire, a supply chain you can see from the temple, a proof that logistics here were not a miracle but a discipline. Step back to the wall and look again at the 6 great faces. Between them, those slender inset stones read like separators or shims, they are also ornaments cut with reliefs so subtle that only certain light admits them. The whole composition is a play of parody, massive slabs, each a sentence, divided by slim clauses that keep them from blurring into one voice. The platform itself is a triumph of layered masonry, great blocks dressed and placed with intention at the front, more irregular fill behind, drains hidden where they must be. A slight inward batter gives the wall stance, like a person leaning forward to hear. The monoliths do not sit perfectly flush, they tilt, whispering a structural logic that keeps them from shearing the first time the mountain shrugs. What, exactly, was this? The precinct is often called a temple of the sun. It is at least that, an address to sky and season, and likely more. From certain places at certain times of year, the sight lines up with light like a tightened string. In June, at the time of the southern winter solstice, the sun rises along mountain edges that the Inca treated not as scenery but as partners, living beings, huacas, whose profiles keep time. You will hear that a face appears on the cliffs opposite, a bearded profile people call Huayracocha, the culture hero whose legends roam the Andes, a maker who walked, taught, and vanished to the west along the water beyond water. You don't need to agree about silhouettes to feel the larger truth, mountains were not backdrops here. They were characters. The wall converses with them. And so the legends enter, as they must. Quechua stories speak of the Viracocha, more properly Huayracocha, an old god or culture bringer whose servants moved stones by art we have forgotten, or who softened rock so a wall could be fitted like cloth. The modern ear should not flinch at this. Myth in the Andes, as everywhere, makes machinery out of memory. When a community experiences hundreds or thousands of bodies moving as one to whip a block across a slope, it is not lying to call that supernatural, it is assigning the correct category of astonishment. And when craft yields joins so exact a fingernail cannot gossip in the seam, the tale of softened stone is only the mind's way of honoring the mason's refusal to let imperfection live. There is also a political clarity in these slabs. The Inca state could command hands across horizons. MITA labor obligations brought farmers and herders into the service of a building season the way a river gathers tributaries. Officials counted work and meals, engineers laid out gradients and pull teams, overseers called rhythms that turned a tug into song. The stones are not only altar or wall, they are the fossil of organization. Even unfinished, they broadcast power with that quiet confidence all durable architecture has. We can make the mountain do this, therefore we can ask you to do much less. Up close, the surfaces reward patience. Pecked fields like stipple turn to polish near the edges, a faint bevel breaks light so the joints read as lines, not hairline accidents. A shallow notch you thought was damage resolves into a handling feature left in place, perhaps to be trimmed after final alignment in a project that never got its last pass. The more you look, the less the wall remains a miracle, and the more it becomes a chain of decisions, how to split the rhyolite so it fractures where you ask, how to translate a quarry mark into a finished face, how to carve a drain that will be invisible to everyone except the water. Down in the town, the Urubamba runs cold and fast, practicing its rapids on rocks too stubborn to move. The market sells fruit and sandals, trains whistle toward Machu Picchu. It is tempting to let the modern motion dissolve the old one. But if you trace with your eyes the line from the quarry to the wall, you can still feel the season when the river grew brief and the ramps grew long, when thousands of hands took hold and the block slid, nodded, slid again. You can see the day a storm made the clay slicker than planned, the men at the brake ropes leaning like trees. You can hear the caller's voice, the one who kept the rhythm even when a skidding edge carved a furrow you can still put your foot in. What remains unresolved is not embarrassing, it is beautiful. There are arguments about whether the final arrangement we see was a mid-construction stage or a finished aesthetic, about whether certain cuts served ritual or purely structural agendas, about whether the tired stones died of logistics or politics. Those debates are not noise, they are the sound of a living past. And they keep us honest, reminding us that explanation is not the enemy of wonder, and wonder not the enemy of care. The river turns the corner, the gorge widens, and the valley opens toward the coast where the world meets a different water. There, on an island city off Syria, blocks as careful as any in the high Andes lie where the sea now licks them. If a mountain is one kind of obstacle in a builder's life, the shoreline is another, the place where time itself likes to redraw plans. We go there next, to a wall that keeps its angle under the surface and asks what a rise in water can erase, or reveal. Our wood looks like a punctuation mark the sea decided to keep. A low oval of stone off the Syrian coast, tight with houses and alleys, ringed by walls that have been recut by many hands, it has watched ships come and go since the age when cedar and purple dye were passports. The Phoenicians called it home, Parados, and for a long time the island was both refuge and launch point, a rock you could trust in waters that didn't always keep their promises. From the mainland, the island is a knuckle. From a boat, the masonry climbs straight out of the green like an argument with the horizon. From below, in the quiet surge where the light thins and fish graze the corners, you see something stranger, courses of blockwork lying just under the surface, a geometry the sea has adopted. The first impression is of familiarity in a foreign place. Massive blocks, faces roughly squared, beds true, set as if the builders expected gravity to reward precision. Between courses, seems so neat they look deliberate even when weight has softened the edges. No mortar you can see, only weight and fit and the long patience of friction. The mind reaches for analogies, Peru's walls, Levantine fortifications ashore, and you have to remind yourself to breathe slowly, to let the underwater light do its flickering work. A wall that once met air now meets fish. A right angle keeps its discipline under the comb of waves. Whatever this was, the sea is only a recent collaborator. It is tempting to declare sea level rise the culprit, to fold Arwood into a single, elegant story of a world that drowned its edges when the ice withdrew. And broadly, that story is true. When the last ice age ended, water took back old river valleys and erased coastlines our ancestors would have known by heart. But time is not all at once. Here, in the eastern Mediterranean, coastlines have also shifted under the weight of earthquakes and the lazy violence of storms. A harbor can drown not only because the ocean climbs but because the ground shrugs, because a season arrives that tears a protective bar to pieces, because a wave train from a far-off quake decides to redraw a map in an afternoon. The old sea keeps its schedule of small rises and occasional leaps. Stonework may keep its line for centuries and then fail in a single winter. The wall you stare at through a scatter of silver fish could be the remnant of a quay or mole dragged down by a dozen different logics that coincide. And yet the human hand is plain. Phoenician builders along this coast were not strangers to large ashlar work, drafted margins, bossed faces, headers that tie a course deep into a wall, stretchers that run long to brace. Later epochs, Hellenistic, Roman, Crusader, Mamluk, layered their own signatures on the same stone genome, concrete in some harbors, finer ashlar in others, repairs that look like apologies and reinforcements that look like teeth. If you run a hand along a submerged block, the skin tells you what your eyes already know: this was cut to persuade water rather than soil, made to meet waves at a particular angle, to turn long energy into harmless eddies. The sea cares about such choices, it hears them even when the city forgets. Divers describe the strange quiet of these places, a wall descending into dim, steps that don't lead anywhere a human can walk, fish flashing between gaps where wooden tie beams, if ever they existed, have long since rotted to silt, the occasional carved face of a block that still shows a margin and a boss like a smoothed knuckle. Sometimes a dolly of stone lies just off the main line, as if a project was interrupted mid-breath. Sometimes rubble has slumped against the base, the result of a single winter storm finding the one-weak seam and worrying it open as if time had grown teeth. Here and there, a line of blocks keeps such good order you could use it as a ruler if the sea would hold still. You can see why people reach quickly for Peru in their comparisons: big blocks, tight joints, no visible glue. But there's a risk in the likeness. The Andes needed their polygonal genius to persuade mountains to survive their own earthquakes. The Phoenician and later engineers here needed something else, the skill to teach a shoreline how to welcome ships and resist the fetch of a prevailing wind. The shared fact is not a global blueprint but a recurring human instinct: if you want something to last, teach the stones to agree with one another so intimately that motion spends itself trying to pry them apart. Whether the threat is a tremor or a storm, precision is a moral as much as a method. Above water, Arwood's history runs busy and layered. The island has been besieged and negotiated over, taxed and allied, garrisoned and rebuilt. Every era left a vocabulary in stone, and every one of those vocabularies, in time, was edited by salt. The Phoenicians left little in the way of inscriptions that would soothe our curiosity. They were doers and traders more than chroniclers, and what writing does survive is often businesslike. Underwater you don't get texts, you get textures. The sea snuffs out paper but preserves, perversely and tenderly, the outlines of a quay. In the cafes on the mainland, when the January wind comes hard across the surf, local stories still remember floods. Not only the famous, far-off deluge you can find in texts, but nearer memory, seasons when the sea stepped over what the elders had been told were its limits. Fish in a street. Boats moored against a stair that used to be a market. A wall we all knew becoming a reef we fish. This is how oral history works. It records impression and effect, the smell of a storm, the sound of a year that broke a rule. Archaeology brings its own instruments, transects and cores, photogrammetry and sonar mosaics, but the living memory of water often points the way to where the measurements should begin. It is also worth remembering how much can be lost without a single dramatic event. A harbor is a machine, tuned constantly. Silt plays tricks. Currents move sandbars like chess pieces. A mole that once forced waves to break safely can fail quietly if a season's worth of small erosion opens a seam. Then the next storm finishes what the year began. The structure is not submerged in a narrative fit for myth so much as it is retired from the human world and adopted by fish, its geometry still perfect for refracting energy, only now the energy is the nervous motion of a school rather than the mass of a hull. Stand on the island's edge at dusk and the Mediterranean lays out its promises, the light broken into 1,000 metallic jokes, the wind pretending to be a messenger. You can imagine the old days, cedar hulls low with amphory, the smell of pitch, voices betting on a weather window. A harbor wall would have been more than a structure then, it was policy rendered in stone, a statement that trade here could make appointments and keep them, that storms could be redirected, that the city had the will to shape its fate at the edge where nature likes to negotiate hard. To find that wall now just under the surface is not only to see loss. It is to see continuity of a different kind, the same stones still doing work, still diverting force, only now for a different client. The temptation, again, is to bind this into our larger flood chorus and pin it to a date. Resist the urge to make a single wave carry every story. The truth at Arwood is layered, Ice Age legacies far older than the island's masonry, earthquakes that turned cities to dust and pushed water inland, small, relentless climbs in sea level that make mockery of a human lifetime, storms whose names died with the men who swore at them. The submerged wall is a palimpsest of all those forces and the answer to a question somebody asked with ambition and skill: can we persuade the sea to behave? When we climb back into the boat, the island's houses turn gold and the wall below keeps being itself, precise and mute. Our next sights will tug us inland again, to circles of basalt that teach sunrise how to thread a doorway. But keep this shoreline in mind, the way the edge of a world edits, the way stone argues with water for as long as it can, and the way, even in defeat, it keeps its lines so well that fish adopt it without changing a thing. At first it looks like nothing, piles of dark stones in a wind that never forgets to arrive. The Golan Heights stretch here in long, low slopes of basalt, a landscape born of old fire and weathered into a field of broken glass. Rum El Hiri sits in that quiet, its Arabic name translating to something like, the stone heap of the wild cat, which is exactly what it resembles from the ground, scattered rubble, cairns collapsed into themselves, snakes of rock wandering without plan. You pick your way along, the stones warm where the sun has touched them, and the sense is of accident. Then someone sends a drone up, or you climb the pictures later, and the accident becomes a diagram. From above it resolves into 5 concentric circles, careful as a compass drawing, rippling out from a massive central pile. The largest ring spans a distance you can feel in your calves, about 160 meters across. The whole thing is built from more stone than you prefer to imagine moving by hand, tens of thousands of tons of basalt gathered and placed so its geometry persists when everything else the builders valued is gone. Even without a date, the intention is palpable. With a date, the intention thickens into mystery. Most archaeologists place Rum el Hiri in the early Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago, the era when stone circles rose like punctuation marks across this part of the world. From the ground you can step into gaps in the rings that behave like doorways. Walk one of those, and you start to understand how the place operates on the body. Walls shoulder high push your view into channels, the circle's curvature forces a kind of inward attention. Follow the earth into the center and the basalt sings a different tune, the rings give way to a tumulus, an engineered mound, with a burial chamber dug inside. That chamber dates a little later than the rings, one of those chronological overlaps ancient sites proliferate, a sacred architecture reused by descendants who understood its magnetism even if they no longer spoke its first language. Locals tell you the best time to visit is before the summer solstice, to test the stories. On that morning, if you're lucky with clouds and patient with cold, the first light threads through an opening and spills into the complex, touching the central mound like a hand. That is not accident. The rings and gaps are aligned to notice the sky's regular oddities, the days when the sun seems to hesitate at the far ends of its yearly path before turning back. You can call Rum el Hiri a calendar, but that feels meager. It's a calendar you can inhabit, a device for making time both observable and communal. It teaches you, in your feet and bones, that the year has a shape and that shape has consequences, when to plant, when to move flocks, when to gather because the sky is making an appointment worth keeping. Basalt is a hard tutor. It doesn't cleave into tidy blocks like limestone, it breaks, grudgingly, into chunks. That makes the circle's precision more persuasive. Someone walked this plateau and chose stones that answered each other, hauled them to a plan, set them in courses that don't tumble even when the winter wind leans at an angle and the summer sun scours. Dry stone work is a species of thought. It has to be. You learn where weight wants to go and you escort it there, you give the wall a slight inward lean so it behaves like an argument that anticipates rebuttals, you arrange voids as deliberately as you arrange solids because a certain kind of gap will funnel wind rather than invite it to pry. The rings endure because a community's hands and habits learn those lessons well enough to make them into muscle memory, and because a circle is a forgiving form, sharing stress like a secret. Who, though, decided that a circle of circles should rise here? The plateau is pastoral country, then as now, a place for flocks and seasonal camps. One theory imagines the builders as herding communities with room in their year for patient, collective projects. Another sees the rings as a ritual precinct where multiple groups met, negotiated marriages and boundaries, buried their dead in the accumulated center, and watched the sun prove it would, after its long walk north, return. You can hear the practical and the sacred arguing politely in those theories, both unwilling to leave the other behind. The site makes space for both. A date in stone is useful when your crops depend on getting the seasons right. A date in stone is also a covenant, a promise to the living that they belong to something larger than their own day. The landscape around Rum el Hiri is shy with inscriptions but generous with stories. The Druze who live in these hills keep legends that speak of giants who stacked the stones overnight, of an earlier people whose reach exceeded the ordinary. Listen to similar tales in Ireland, in Armenia, in the Caucasus, in the Andes, and you begin to hear the deep human rhythm beneath the details. When later communities stand before older skill, they translate scale into stature. Giants is not a lie, it is a metaphor for coordination, how many backs, how many seasons, how much shared belief it takes to raise something this stubbornly simple. Another set of stories insists the site was the work of ancient astronomers, a school whose chalk was basalt and whose chalkboard was the sky. There's no need to oppose the tales, they braid. To notice solstice light precisely you must be both patient and curious, to carry stones this far and fit them into walking circles you must be both many and steady. Excavations in the central mound revealed a burial chamber cut deep, stones corbelled inward to create a small domed space within the heap. Human remains suggest later use, a tradition of honoring important dead within a monument that may have begun life as a more general ritual landscape. Shards and small finds come from a tangle of centuries. This is sites like this, the first act compelling enough that generations keep rewriting the play on the same stage. What resists rewriting is the underlying geometry. Aerial photographs, even the grainy ones, show the rings clean, their arcs truer than you think a field of lumps can be. On the ground, the earth blurs those arcs in grass and shadow until a morning like the solstice wakes the place and the logic snaps into focus again. We like to imagine that such precision required architects in the modern sense and measurement in the modern voice. The truth is stealthier. You can build a circle with rope and stake and 3 good pairs of eyes. You can find east by watching where the sun proves itself consistent. You can check your work by returning next year and the next and noting what needs a hand's correction. None of this reduces the accomplishment. It enlarges it. It anchors the monument in repeatable acts rather than singular genius. It declares that time, patient, communal time, is itself a tool. Walk the outermost ring and the wind edits your thoughts. Basalt underfoot gives a steady, crisp sound, like the page turn of a heavy book. The view is a long, low undulation to every horizon, punctuated by later ruins, tank tracks, new fences. The circles keep their own manners amid that, a sort of calm insistence. You realize, an hour in, that the site is working on you the way it worked on its makers and users. You begin to measure without measuring, to mark where the light falls on a certain stone at a certain hour, to notice the way an opening frames a particular lump of far hill. This is a language you don't have to speak to understand. Step into the central heap and the mood changes again. It's closer, darker, intimate. Death is part of the design here, not a vandal of it. The later burial tells you something that all such places tell if you listen. Even after a society forgets the first reason for a monument, it remembers that the place is strong medicine, good for binding communities and honoring thresholds. The dead lie where the living count the year turns where the dead lend the earth gravity. It is a humane arrangement. When you leave, the rings fall back into rubble if you don't look over your shoulder. The wind resumes its rules. A few kilometers from here, border signs and modern anxieties make time feel thin again. Keep the memory of this geometry under your ribs. We will need it where we are going next, into a desert where a pair of sandstone boulders stand like twin arguments and a single, too straight seam divides them so neatly that even geologists sometimes pause, mid-explanation, to let the wonder speak first. You meet it after a long run of ochre flats and sky, 2 sandstone bodies leaning toward one another like a conversation interrupted, divided by a seam so exact you feel your own posture straighten in response. This is Al-Nasla, outside Tama in Saudi Arabia's northwest, and the first impulse is to call the split impossible. The cut runs almost plumb, crisp as a bookmark slipped between pages, and each half of the boulder perches on a small pedestal as if the desert has practiced balancing tricks in secret. Sunlight slides along the fracture and the rock throws a line of shadow that behaves like a ruler. Even people who have seen a lifetime of stone will stand here a minute longer than they planned, mid-breath, letting the neatness unsettle them. From one face a gallery of petroglyphs looks out, animals with their legs mid-stride, figures rendered in the plain declarative grammar of desert art, inscriptions that speak in script scholars tag as ancient North Arabian. The carvings don't answer the split, they complicate it. If artists chose this stone, was it because the line already existed and felt meaningful, a ready-made border to echo the edge between worlds? Or did the presence of marks make later visitors more willing to believe the seam was deliberate, a human intervention so clean it must have been done with tricks we have since forgotten? The desert is a patient sculptor with a toolkit more varied than we grant it. Sand-laden winds abrade the lower portions of rock faster than the upper, undercutting and leaving mushroom pedestals where softer layers have gone wandering. Thermal stress opens weaknesses as the sun teaches stone to breathe, expanding by day, contracting at night, until hairline fractures become joints and joints become planes. Salt from occasional rain wicks into microscopic pores and, when crystals grow, pries grains apart one persuasion at a time. Along an existing fracture, capillary moisture lingers, chemical weathering loosens cement there first, wind exploits the loosened edge. Over years that outnumber our patience, a crack can sharpen into an apparently intentional line. Geologists looking at Al Nasla tend to reach for that family of explanations, a natural joint or fault exploited by weathering, differential erosion carving the twin pedestals, perhaps a small shift in the stone atop it supports exaggerating the sharpness of the gap. The precision that startles us is part fact, part theater. Stand on the right axis and the seam looks blade straight. Move a little and you see its small wiggles, the tasteful imperfections of a line drawn by earth rather than instrument. That doesn't make it less wondrous. It simply trades one kind of marvel for another, not, how did a hidden engineer do this, but, how did slow forces, given enough rehearsal, stage a trick our eyes can't help calling intentional. Tama's oasis, a day's drive from the Red Sea, has been a crossroads so long that myth and record are both at home here. Ancient trade routes braided through this water and date palms, caravans came hungry for shade. A Babylonian king repaired here for a decade in the 6th century BCE, if you trust the old texts that remember his exile, steely carved with local gods bear witness to a city that knew how to speak to power in both stone and commerce. The rock art around Al Nasla is part of that longer story, silhouettes that look simple from a distance and complex up close, marks that say, we were here, to anyone willing to listen. It's not far-fetched to imagine that a place with water, traffic, and a striking rock would become a gallery and a landmark both. Still, the human mind loves a lever. When faced with a boulder cleaved as if by blade, we imagine blades. Speculation is swift, ancient tools beyond our acknowledgement, a ritual split performed to proclaim mastery over stone, a demonstration left for posterity and now misread as geology. Such stories are not foolish, they are the right kind of respect, the kind given to ancestors whose choices outlasted their names. But respect is larger than marvel. It asks us to notice the signatures of wind and salt, to feel how the lower rock's undercutting is exactly what a benefactrich landscape would write, to understand that a joint as straight as this one is less rare in sandstone than our surprise suggests. None of that cancels the place's strangeness on the body. Stand with your toes at the seam and the hush feels curated, wind combing the flats, a faint hum in your ears where sun presses, the taste of dust sharpening language. A bird crosses the line between halves, indifferent. Shade gathers at the crack and you experience the seam as a clock, measuring the day with a march of edges. If the petroglyph carvers used this face to teach or commemorate, they did so with a background that already behaved like a device. Local stories give the site different parents. Some speak of skilled craftsmen who could persuade stone like a stubborn animal, others invite beings not quite human to share credit. In one telling the split appeared overnight, a reminder that the land belongs to forces unafraid to work fast when they choose. Folklore is a technology for explaining all with dignity intact. It assigns agency where agency is felt, even if cause is hidden. When a joint looks like a judgment, we write a judge into the tale. When two boulders balance on thin ankles without toppling through a dozen storm seasons, we write a tender into the script. The scientific counterpoint is not a scold, it is a harmony line. Seismic murmurs thread this region, an ancient jolt could have opened the initial fracture. Groundwater once rose and fell here in different rhythms, capillary chemistry could have loved that seemed to sharpness over centuries. Cross-bedding in the sandstone, where layers laid down by old winds and waters meet at angles, gives the rock a directional character, stress travels that grain and fails along it. Put all that under a sky where temperature swings seem almost performative and add a continental scale sandblaster running most afternoons, and you begin to see how a whisper becomes a word a sentence the declarative line we now read as decision. There is another way to hold the debate that keeps its delight. Imagine that Al Nasla is a collaboration between stone and story. The geology stages a phenomenon, a slim, elegant cleft and twin pedestals. Human beings arrive, carve, camp, trade, pray, gossip. They add images to the surface, names to the air. They explain the split to their children and their rivals in whatever language fits the century: gods, tools, omens, accident, and in telling, they make the sight heavier with meaning than geology alone could manage. Centuries pass. We come in with cameras and measuring tapes and the soft tyranny of modern words. If we are generous, we leave with both, the comfort of a plausible process and the work of a story that refuses to be only process. Walk around the pear and the line changes character as light does. Midday is austere, the seam a hard declaration. Toward evening the angle fills with gold and the two halves look less like separated bodies than halves allowed to breathe. On the lee side, a crust of desert varnish, minerals and microbes painting patience into the skin, gives the rock its polished, darkened sheen. On the windward side, the grain feels rasped, a reminder that time's main technique here is repetition more than drama. Before you leave, step back far enough that the two blocks and their pedestals fit in your eye at once. The desert beyond is empty in the generous way, full of possible paths rather than empty of meaning. A truck may pass in the distance, a line of shimmering air over its hood. Al-Nasla will keep being itself after you go, a seam in stone, a shelf for drawings, a problem set the earth assigns to anyone willing to think slowly in hot light. The debate, natural, made, or some braid of both, will follow you out to the road and into the evening. Let it. Some riddles deserve to remain companions rather than adversaries, not because they cannot be solved, but because their best gift is the kind of attention they teach. Next we turn back to Egypt, to a chamber that seems older than the temple that shelters it, heavy pillars ankle-deep in water, joints that look Roman in their confidence but belong to a different story, and a name that ties the place to rebirth. If Al-Nasla is a line drawn by weather that behaves like decision, the Osirian at Abydos is decision built so cleanly it looks like geology. Behind the long galleries of Seti I's temple at Abydos, behind its carved reliefs and painted ceilings, behind lists of kings and the neat procession of offerings, there is a door the ground itself seems to keep. You step through a later passage and the world drops in scale and sound. Ahead, half below the desert's grade, a rectangle opens. Thick, red granite pillars shoulder a roof of huge stone beams. A narrow watercourse girdles a central island like a moat around a word you're not yet allowed to say. This is the Osirian, a name that points at Osiris, lord of the dead and of renewal, and the first feeling it gives is not ornament but fact. The architecture is austere. The stones are large. The design is simple in the way a heartbeat is simple, repeated, strong, necessary. Water has a way of making the Osirian seem older than anything near it. It gathers here with a stubbornness that defeats pumps and plans, a shallow pool that rises and falls with the hidden moods of the water table, turning the place into a reflection machine. The central island, an image scholars read as the primeval mound, the first land lifting out of the waters of none at creation, sits there like a thought surfacing. Pillars stand with their feet in the flood, and the granite darkens where the water licks it. Seti's temple above is all surface stories, hundreds of figures teaching the living how to behave before the gods. The Osirian is a different voice. It is a diagram of beginnings made from the vocabulary of endings. The engineering is frank. Pillars of Aswan granite, each the weight of a small locomotive, rise to support roof slabs that look like they were meant to be permanent. The joints are sharp, the courses level, the corners almost moral in their rightness. There is decoration here and there, traces of funerary books in the side chambers, later inscriptions, but the main hall wears no busy reliefs. It does not need them. You can feel the intention in your calves as you step down, level by level, toward the water, like descending into the innards of a ritual. Doorways open from the surrounding passage into barrel-roofed rooms cut deep, a rhythm of spaces that reads as both practical and ceremonial, places to stage recitations, to store objects, to mark stops on a journey that Egyptians imagined every night as the sun passed through the underworld and every lifetime as a soul did the same. To stand here is to be reminded that Egyptian religion was not vague about geography. The dead went somewhere. The journey had stations and gates and guardians. Osiris was not just an old story about a murdered king and a loving wife, he was the promise that dismembered things could be made whole, that cut bodies could be reassembled, that the land itself could rise again after the flood withdrew. A building dedicated to him ought to feel like a place built to host a reenactment of creation, and that is what the Osirian does. The central island is a stage for the first mound, the encircling water is the remembered chaos, the heavy stones are the insistence that the order carved here can resist whatever tries to dissolve it. Because it looks and feels older than its neighbors, the Osirian has always drawn a certain kind of speculation. Stand in Seti's hypostyle hall and you are in the 13th century BCE, surrounded by the emotional clarity of New Kingdom art, fluid figures, fine chiseling, paint like breath. Step into the Osirian and the style changes, megalithic, spare, a grammar we recognize from Egypt's earlier appetite for mass in places like the Valley Temple beside the Sphinx. That stylistic mismatch has tempted some to push the Osirian back beyond its usual date, to imagine a far older kernel adopted and framed by Seti's work. Others point to the high water as if it were an old scar, proof of floods and rains that belonged to climates before history. The scholarly consensus, sober and careful, keeps the structure where the inscriptions and contexts put it, a New Kingdom work designed to look primeval on purpose, a deliberate archaism that complements the temple above. But the debate is part of the site's atmosphere. Even when you assent to the dating, the stones whisper about inheritance, about a culture that liked to speak in modern voices while building in ancient ones when it needed gravity. There is myth here beyond Osiris. The Egyptians told themselves that after men ruled the kingdom, before them ruled the followers of Horus, beings who were not quite like us and lived in spans of time that dwarf a human king's reign. You do not have to take that literally to feel the power of the claim. Our institutions remember something older than writing, our sacred places are older than our stories about them. When we build anew we often choose to set the new on top of the old, not out of laziness but out of respect. The Osirian is physically that idea, a late monument sewn to an older mythic fabric, made to look as if it had always been there, always at work. Even the way you approach it, through later additions, past reused blocks, the desert pressing close, gives the impression of a place found rather than made. And yet, made is the point. The precision is not mystical. The stone came from quarries up the Nile, ferried and hauled and set by men whose titles we can still read in other places, overseers of works, chiefs of quarrymen, scribes of the granaries that fed the crews. To imagine the Osirian is to imagine lists and ledgers, perishable papyri crowded with neat hands counting bread and beer, to imagine ramps growing like patient dunes, to imagine someone with a bit of cord testing a right angle until it agreed with his eye. Craft sits here inside myth without conflict. It always does. The better the myth, the more exact the craft must be to carry it. Water complicates excavation and preserves the mood. For more than a century since the building was cleared from drifted sand, the pool has stayed. It is not fed by a spring in the romantic sense, it is the groundwater's level, tugged by irrigation upstream, the Nile's seasonal moods, and whatever the desert has absorbed. That water, inconvenient to archaeologists, is very convenient to the story the place tells. It keeps the granite dark and reflective, it turns pillars into sundials, it ensures you cannot forget the building's central premise, land among water, order among older forces, a chamber where you can say the right words and the world does what it once did at the beginning. Climb back up toward Seti's bright reliefs and you feel the contrast in your bones. The painted myths above are narrative. The hall below is thesis. Above, Osiris as a figure in crowds, the ritual calendar, the king becoming what the story says a king must become. Below, the stripped diagram of rebirth reduced to its minimums, mass, water, island, passage. People argue about whether the Osirian's aesthetics prove a different age or simply a different intention. The truth that survives the debate is that Egypt knew how to wield antiquity as a tool. When you wanted to speak to a god older than the state, you did not dress the chamber in the style of your own hour. You reached for an older voice and carved it into place. It is easy to be seduced by the idea of an out-of-place megalith in Egypt, as if the old kingdom's love of huge stone had been a fashion that died and suddenly reappeared. The continuity is deeper. Big stones endure where big ideas require bodies. Abydos, for Egyptians, was a principal address for the afterlife, a place Osiris was, a place the royal dead and the pious living came to anchor their hopes. Seti's temple honors that with a masterwork in color and line. The Osirian honors it with weight and water. As we leave, the light on the central island has changed. The water takes on a thin sheen that mirrors the ceiling, the pillars red as silhouettes, the whole room breathes like a lung carved out of geology. Outside, the desert is blunt in its brightness. Inside, the stone has made a weather of its own. We step back through the corridors into galleries crowded with scenes. Then out again into the day, our eyes narrowed, our ears ringing with the quiet we've just left. From here we'll cross far west and north, to edges of the Atlantic where people built monuments out of passage and light, corridors that admit the sun only on a handful of days as if letting a god through by appointment. In Spain, a long, low mound hides a richly carved throat of stone. In Ireland, a great white-faced circle receives the year's shortest sunbeam like a kept promise. If the Osirian is Egypt's grammar for rebirth in mass and water, those Atlantic tombs are its poetry in light and shadow. The Atlantic air has a way of arriving sideways, salt-touched even inland, with a softness that hides distance. In Huelva's quiet fields near Trigueros, a low mound rises with the modesty of a haystack, its secret a long throat of stone. This is Dolmen de Soto, 5 millennia old, older than most of the names we give the land. From the outside you see earth and a rounded hill and perhaps, if the light is brutally honest, the faint line of the entrance. Step inside and the world narrows to a corridor just wide enough to keep you aware of your shoulders. The ceiling presses down but not unkindly, the stones on either side are close enough to touch both at once, which you will do without meaning to. Your fingers find shallow grooves, spirals, chevrons, small recesses, and the abrasion of centuries of other hands doing exactly what yours are doing now. The passage runs for nearly 21 meters, a physical sentence that takes a minute to read. At its end the corridor swells into a chamber shaped as if memory were spatial, uprights leaning slightly inward to hold a capstone, the circle and oval echoing the mound that hides it all. It is not clear whether the carvings you passed were graffiti of the sacred or the planned decoration of the stone's first life. They feel deliberate. Abstract designs purr into one another, spirals that might be the long attention to the sun's yearly walk, zigzags that recall water or light, lozenges that behave like nets for meaning. Stylized figures stand among them, schematic and dignified. In a few places the grooves deepen as if tools returned over long time to the same lines, refreshing them when the stone forgot. Dolmen de Soto keeps an appointment with the sky. At the equinoxes, those rare days of balance when night and day divide the calendar like honest partners, the rising sun pushes a beam along the passage and into the chamber, waking carvings that otherwise live in diffuse gloom. It does not feel theatrical. It feels instructional. A community gathered at the mouth, waiting on a light that travels through a stone throat to a stone heart, learns that year and place can talk to each other. If you wish to know when to sow, when to travel, when to remember the dead, you can ask the sky, but if you wish to ask with precision you put the sky in a corridor and teach it to behave like a clock. Who made this and why does not strain the imagination in one sense. It is a tomb, a ceremonial place, a machine for making memory the size of a building. But to call it a tomb is like calling a cathedral a roof. The passage makes a procession inevitable, the narrowed light makes a narrative of the morning. People had to be there together for it to work, some standing, some perhaps singing, someone keeping count. In an age when most knowledge went by breath and body, the dolmen's accuracy declared the community's reliability. The stones said, "We know the year, therefore we know when to feed you, therefore we can be trusted with your dead." This passage tomb is not an eccentric one-off. The Atlantic facade of Europe, Portugal's coast, Brittany's granite fields, Ireland's river valleys, keeps a grammar of megaliths that rhyme across water. Long corridors that open into chambers, uprights that batter inward, capstones that turn geology into roof, carvings that repeat motifs as if a regional school traveled by boat. Dolmen de Soto is one dialect of that shared language, tuned by local stone and local sky. Sail north in your mind and the fields turn greener, the light more mercurial, the air thick with weather pregnant with rain. In the Boyne Valley of Ireland sits a mound that looks like a giant's drum, its face bright with white quartz, its skirt ringed by massive curbstones scored with art as if the horizon itself needed ornament. Newgrange is older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid, a Neolithic work raised around 3200 BCE that refuses to behave like a ruin. 80-something meters across and roughly 13 high, it holds a passage just under 19 meters long, ending in a cruciform chamber with 3 recesses like small apses. Each recess once held basin stones. Cremated bone is part of this place's quiet inventory. To enter, you duck under an entrance stone engraved with whorls and lozenges so intricate the eye goes crosswise for a moment. Above the doorway a roof box, a carefully engineered opening, waits for a single yearly task. On the mornings around the winter solstice, the shortest days the sun admits to, light fractures at the horizon and creeps into the mound, not through the door where visitors enter but through that roof box. The beam threads the passage and warms the chamber's floor in a rectangle that feels like an oath being kept. For the rest of the year, the interior remains in crafted night. When the light arrives, the stones refuse to be just stones. Their carvings stir, spirals, zigzags, the famous triple spiral that has come to symbolize the site and much else besides. The room is small enough that bodies make weather inside it, breath, awe, the throat clearing of someone who was sure they were ready and is now unsure. Outside, the mound's white face collects whatever light the day is giving. Inside, the beam is a promise, after the longest dark, return. Newgrange's builders used more techniques than ceremony. The passage roof is corbelled, each course of stone laid so it projects slightly inward beyond the one below, until opposite walls meet in a stone beehive that sheds water as if it were a crafted shell. That, plus a dry stone brilliance that persuades weight to behave, has kept the interior more or less dry for millennia. The quartz facade, restored in modern times from material found at the mound's base, likely approximates an original face that caught low sun and made the whole monument announce itself from across the valley. The curbstones around the base are not afterthoughts, each is a deliberate placement, their carved surfaces not ornaments but arguments. One thinks in particular of the entrance curbstone, deeply incised spirals and diamonds that feel like a music the eyes can hum. The famous triple spiral inside one recess is not a code we can read, but it is a rhythm we can feel, a diagram of cycles, a geometry of return. As with Dolmen de Soto, the intentions here braid the practical and the poetic so tightly it becomes rude to separate them. The solstice beam is a calendar and a catechism. The burial basins tell you who is invited to the center, honored dead whose remains share a chamber with sunlight on 2 or 3 mornings in a year. The crowding of art on certain surfaces suggests places where attention had to slow, thresholds, turns, the moment before center. The mound itself is a mountain people could make, a hill of meaning anchored with retaining stones so it would not simply become landscape again. Myth arrives like weather over pasture. Irish tradition speaks of the Tuatha De Danann, an old, shining people who retreated into the city, the mounds, when later human tribes took the surface world. The stories are stitched with magic and art and music and the kind of craftsman's pride that always attaches to ancestors imagined as excellent. It is not an insult to the archaeology to say the myths feel true in a larger register. If you build a hill that can hold a sunbeam by appointment and you bury your best within it, later generations will correctly guess that this is not mere architecture. They will people it with beings capable of tasks most of us have forgotten how to organize, and they will assign to the site a power that ordinary thresholds do not have. Newgrange, even in the way visitors are admitted, by chance, in small numbers, in the dim, protects that sense. Across the water from Spain to Ireland the same instincts persist, stone as a means to hold the sky still long enough to teach from it, carving as a way to give pattern to attention, corridors that compress the body so the mind is primed for surprise. The Atlantic world's passage tombs are not evidence for a single ancient blueprint so much as evidence that different coasts, faced with the same materials and the same sun, arrive at similar ways to fix time inside a room. When you step back out of Newgrange the ordinary world floods in, wind, sheep, a bus reversing somewhere with a beep that feels indecent. The mound keeps its weather behind you, the dolmen in Spain keeps its low cool in your bones. You have been reminded that light itself can be architecture and that death, for these builders, was not seclusion but inclusion, a placing within the calendar's deepest hinge. We carry that forward now to a different colossal grammar, no corridors and sunbeams this time, but blocks of limestone so huge they seem like a dare, a foundation for later empires and earlier questions. In Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, the terraces at Baalbek hold stones whose scale is a riddle the centuries have not yet finished answering. The Bekaa Valley opens like a long-held breath, vineyards and dust and the far blue of ridges, then the ground lifts into a stone platform so large it feels like a mistake on the map. Baalbek has been a holy address for a very long time, Heliopolis to the Romans, city of the sun, and their temples still declare the fact with surviving columns that look like prologues to mountains. But it is the terrace beneath, the podium's western side, that hijacks your attention and doesn't give it back, 3 limestone blocks in a row, each one a small ship of a stone, set so tightly that shadow has to ask permission to pass. The trilithon, people call them. The word sounds made up until you stand there and admit that naming is the least we can do. The numbers, even done carefully, feel like fiction. Each of the 3 measures roughly 20 meters in length, about 4 in height, and a little over 3 in thickness. The weights are estimates because you cannot risk prying one free to check, but most calculations cluster around 800 tons per block. If you want to feel that as more than a count of zeros, convert it, 800,000 kilograms times 9.81 meters per second squared gives a weight of about 7,848,000 newtons. Put differently, it's the kind of downward insistence that teaches even a mountain valley humility. Across a short walk to the southwest, the quarry yawns. In its bed lies the celebrity stone nobody managed to move, Hajar el-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman, a giant left cradled in earth that runs, by conservative estimates, toward 1,000 tons. Nearby, half buried and longer still, another block was found in recent years, bigger by a margin that makes the first seem almost modest. These were not idle fantasies in rock. Their faces are squared, margins drafted. Someone intended them to travel, and then something, season, politics, an accident, a calculation made honestly and found wanting, intervened. The Roman temples above, their capitals scrolled and their entablatures carried like logic, were raised 2 millennia ago. The platform that bears them is a layered thing, earlier foundations and later ambitions, seams where builders from different eras argued with each other in stone and then agreed to disagree. The trilithon sits in a course higher than the common run of podium masonry, like a boast made mid-sentence. Whether that boast belonged to Roman engineers weaving local technique into imperial scale, or to earlier builders whose work Rome chose to adopt and overlay, remains a discussion you can still hear among archaeologists in the site's dust. The westward extension, sometimes called Podium 2, a great megalithic wall running parallel to the main podium but not bonded to it, reads like an unfinished paragraph. Someone began a thought and stopped speaking aloud. The stones we have are the nouns and verbs they did not manage to decline into completion. How do you move a thing like that? The temptation is to throw up myth because myth is faster than friction. Local stories do it honestly, giants who played at stone the way children play at staves, heroes whose strength was a moral as much as a muscle. These legends are not stupid. They are respect in a grammar that honors scale. But it is also a kind of respect to do the arithmetic. Suppose you set that 800-ton block on a wooden sledge and prepared a bed of wet clay or rounded cobbles. If the coefficient of friction you achieve is around 0.2, a figure experimental archaeologists sometimes reach with lubrication and good luck, the horizontal pull needed is mu times the weight, 0.2 times 7,848,000 almost equals 1,569,600 newtons. If a worker can sustain, say, 300 newtons of pull for long stretches, you would need on the order of 5,232 people on the ropes at once. Lower the effective friction to 0.05 with an even better setup of rollers and slurry, and the required pull drops to about 392,400 newtons, somewhere around 1,300 people, not counting crews to tend the bed, shift the rollers, brake, sing the rhythm. This is not a recipe, it is a demonstration that numbers do not prohibit the act outright. They demand organization, ramps, causeways, seasons chosen for firm ground, food for thousands, foremen who can convert bodies into a single intention. And the last centimeters are the punishing part. Getting a mass moving is one problem, teaching it to stop exactly where you planned is another. Here, the platform itself becomes a tool. Builders could prepare a slightly rising approach, let gravity be the brake, edge the sledge forward with levers, drop the block a handspan onto bedding, then dress the final faces in place. Sand pits can be dug and refilled to lift and lower increments without violence. Cribbing, stacks of timbers and stones, can lift or relieve as needed. Levers multiplied by wedges can translate a few dozen men's effort at a corner into a block settling a finger's width, then another, until two faces kiss and accept each other. None of this is easy. But it is within the documented repertoire of ancient engineering, multiplied by the patience great projects require and imperial systems can sometimes supply. Still, you feel why people reach for extravagance. Stand with your palm on a trilithon block and the seam to its neighbor is so clean it makes a tidy person feel seen. The bedding is not just flat, it is persuaded. The blocks are not only set, they are aligned at a height where a misjudgment would announce itself from miles away. There are drafted margins here and there, traces of bosses that may have been left to serve as grips. On the quarry floor you can find the negative of these giants, channels cut to isolate the body of the stone from its bed, undercuts ready for wedges. The continuity of technique ties one landscape to the other, the bed a negative mold, the podium a cast. Baalbek's legendary belongs to its people as much as its stones do. Guides will tell you the giant's tales with a grin that has pride inside it. They will point to the pregnant woman and give you 3 different reasons for her name, one tender, one body, one practical. They'll let the mystery breathe because breathing is half the draw. There are also more recent stories the valley keeps, earthquakes that taught the platform's joints to groan, winters that gnawed at the edges, centuries when the site served as a quarry of convenience because the best stones are always those already wrestled out of the earth. Even the Romans practiced that kind of reuse, and later builders did not blush at joining them. If you want to find the site's human scale, step away from the big blocks and notice the ordinary genius running everywhere. Drains are tucked where they must be so that water will not do what water always tries. Retaining courses batter inward a degree or two so their stance reads as intention. Tool marks play across some faces like the grain of a wooden panel, pecking where aggression was needed, smoother passes where the masons were courting a joint. A platform this arrogant with mass is, almost paradoxically, humble in detail. It knows that 1,000 small courtesies to stone will achieve what one brazen command never could. And if you want to hear the city the platform supported, let your eye climb. The temple of Jupiter's surviving columns carry Corinthian capitals as if they were meant to be briefed on the weather. The scale is Roman bravado, yes, but deeply local in how it sits on the old hill, in how the light behaves on the stone in late afternoon, in how the dust rises when feet do. Sacred places, in the Levant especially, keep their addresses while tenants change. Baalbek is a stack of such tenancies, Canaanite, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Ottoman, modern. The megaliths below behave as a kind of ground truth through all that, whoever rules, gravity still wants proof you can argue with it and win. There are theories that try to settle authorship like a lawsuit. Was the trilithon the work of an earlier, non-Roman culture whose knowledge we underestimate? Was it a Roman team flexing its capacity to marshal labor and apply math on a heroic scale, perhaps even beginning a Western extension they then abandoned? The stones do not tell, and their silence is not ignorance. It is reticence. They were raised in a world where credit went to gods and kings long before it trickled down to overseers and crews. What remains for us is not a name to praise but a standard to admire. This is how careful you have to be to teach a valley to keep a line this true. When you walk back toward the road, the block in the quarry comes last, like a friend you promised to visit. It lies at an angle, warm, strangely gentle in its immobility. The mind plays with the possibility that leaving it was the most intelligent choice anyone made on the project, a reminder that ambition has an edge, a monument to restraint. Or maybe it was just a winter that came too soon, a levy unpaid, a war on the horizon, a foreman who got sick. The grandest stories we tell ourselves often hide on the backs of small contingencies. We leave the valley not with an answer but with a recalibrated sense of what humans can persuade stone to do when belief, bureaucracy, and time line up. The next chapter asks a different kind of persuasion, earth shaped into mythic bodies, cities made from mounds rather than blocks, calendars laid out in soil and horizon. In the woodlands and prairies of North America, a serpent stretches its coils along a ridge, a city of earth terraces the floodplain, and a lunar cycle is caught in a geometry you can see from the sky. The materials change. The precision does not. In southern Ohio the land rises into a narrow ridge and, for nearly a quarter of a mile, the earth becomes a body. Serpent Mound moves in long coils, a sinuous embankment of soil and stone about as tall as a person at the spine, its head widening into an oval shape as if swallowing or birthing an egg of earth. You can walk the length and feel the rhythm in your calves, but the design reveals itself best to a bird, or a camera lucky with light, where the whole creature unfurls in a single breath. The first impression is theatrical. The second is precise. The serpent's head faces the place where the summer solstice sun slides down to the horizon, other curves nod toward equinox and winter sunrises, and to lunar positions that keep quieter, longer calendars. However the builders measured, whatever instruments they carried in their heads and hands, the earthwork makes the sky legible with a grace that feels like a memory trick, day and night staged on a ridge where the horizon obeys. To call it an effigy is true but insufficient. It is a walkway, a gathering place, a line drawn thick enough for people to stand upon and think together. The alignment is not an accident you can see everywhere if you squint. It's a habit the mound has, an appointment with the year that repeats as faithfully as the river below coils through its valley. Once you learn that the head receives sunset at the year's high day, it is hard not to sense a ritual, the moment when the light rests where the earth shaped itself to hold it, when those who tended the place could say aloud that the turning point has come and we are ready. And if you stand at night during one of the moon's extreme risings, events that take nearly 19 years to complete their full cycle, the ridgelines begin to make room for another rhythm. The serpent is a story about movement and return, it's a chart you can walk. Farther west, where the Mississippi's floodplain broadens into a stage for weather, a city in earth rose, breathed, and transformed. Cahokia was not a single mound but a metropolis of them, more than 100 earthen platforms shaped from millions of basketloads of soil, plazas leveled with a surveyor's patience, neighborhoods stitched together by causeways and palisades. The largest of these, Monk's Mound, sits like a verdict, for terraces ascending to a summit where a great building once observed the valley. Its footprint covers roughly 14 acres, larger than the base of the Great Pyramid. Its height, around 30 meters, draws your eye like a cliff that decided to be geometric. The city around it at its peak, 1,000 years ago, may have numbered in the tens of thousands, population dense enough that archaeology has to think in neighborhoods and refuse heaps, not just monuments. Wood-hinged circles, rings of posts set in careful radii, caught solstice and equinox dawns, morning after morning, so that the civic year and the celestial could agree in public. Walk through the site's present quiet and the order is still audible. The Grand Plaza gathers the city into a bowl of packed earth, avenues lead the eye and the feet, smaller mounds keep the conversation going at human scale. A palisade once ran like a stitched seam across the landscape, a statement about who was inside, who outside, who was meant to see what, when. The city's planners placed authority on platforms where it would be seen against the sky, then mirrored that sky with circles of posts that taught the calendar. Politics and astronomy were not separate departments, they were a braid. To keep the ceremonies on time, corn, diplomacy, obligation, you had to keep the heavens in view. North and east, in the riverlands of central Ohio, geometry the size of towns turned the ground into instruments. The Newark earthworks once spread across roughly 4 square miles, enormous circles and octagons and avenues laid out with a loving intolerance for sloppiness. What survives today, an octagon linked to a circle by a long straight neck, a separate great circle, still feels like a machine that only the sky can explain. Stand at certain points in the octagon and, on rare nights during the moon's 18.6-year cycle, a lunar standstill rise or set lines exactly along a causeway. The builders must have watched for decades, perhaps generations, testing and correcting, to teach soil to match the moon's long exhale. It is one thing to align a doorway to a solstice sunrise you can check every year. It is another to align a horizon to events that return so slowly a child present at one maximum will be gray at the next. Precision here is not a stunt, it's a declaration that patience is communal. All of these places, serpents, mounds, circles, were names applied by later tongues. Their makers were not silent, they simply did not write with ink on stone. Many descendant nations today speak for these sites, Shawnee and Miami, Delaware, Lenape, and others in the Ohio Valley's story, Osage, Otomazuria, Omaha, Ho-Chunk, Kaw, Kansa, Quapaw, and more with ties to Cahokia's broader world. In their nation's telling, these are sacred landscapes, living. A prayer is appropriate. A camera is possible but not sufficient. When tribal elders speak about Woodhenge, they do not require that you memorize azimuths. They ask that you understand why a community would shape time into a circle and stand inside it together. When they speak of the serpent, they talk about power and responsibility and the long, patient work of tending both. Archaeology offers its own gifts without canceling those voices. It can count posts and reconstruct circles, it can sieve soil and tell you when fires burned and when they stopped, it can show you that, for a time, Cahokia pulsed with a sudden brightness, new neighborhoods, intensified trade, ritual explosiveness, and then, in the following century, its heartbeat changed. Reasons are plural, climate shifting the length of growing seasons, floods and droughts arriving out of turn, political stresses that made consensus costlier, disease and conflict that arrived with contact centuries later but reshaped memory backwards. The earthworks persist because they were not improvisations. They were contracts written in soil. There is a humility to building in dirt that stone rarely admits. Soil slumps, rain edits, grass argues, burrowing creatures revise. To keep a mound city standing and sharp you need maintenance woven into the year, renewal rituals, crews with baskets and shovels, watchers who notice when an edge begins to blur. That is part of what these places teach, monument as practice rather than as finished object. The serpent keeps its shape because hands returned. The circle keeps its measure because people came back with stakes and rope and memory, because the community refused to let geometry become merely a rumor. And yet the ambition is every bit as grand as the biggest stones set in Peru or Lebanon. To ask the earth to behave like an effigy 400 meters long is to match a megalith for megalith in patience. To ask a circle to announce a lunar maximum that won't repeat for almost 2 decades is to make planning a virtue and continuity a sacrament. The materials differ. The intelligence does not. The same urge that sets lintels to catch a solstice beam sets cedar posts and rings to do the same instinct that fits polygonal masonry so it shrugs off an earthquake lays layers of compacted fill in a mound so rain has to work to undo it. The most important adjustment many of us must make when we visit is to slow our sense of ownership of the story. Indigenous nations are not artifacts of these places, they are stewards and descendants with living relationships to them. When they ask that drones not fly over certain ceremonies, when they ask that visitors move quietly or keep a respectful distance, they are not restricting access to history. They are doing what the builders did, placing the sacred inside the calendar, returning to agreements older than our maps. If you listen, the scholarship and the sovereignty reinforce each other. Archaeologists confirm alignments, elders confirm meanings. Measurements can tell you when light will arrive, tradition can tell you why it matters that it does. By the time you leave this chapter of the story, your sense of monument may have shifted. A wall of fitted stone now rhymes with a ridge of raised earth, a platform blocked the size of a bus rhymes with a circle so vast you can't see its curve from the ground. What lingers is that feeling of appointment kept, light in a passage at the darkest day, sunset arriving in the serpent's mouth at the longest, a moonrise returning to a notch after almost 20 years as if nothing important had been forgotten. The past speaks here not in names of kings but in the persistence of attention. The message isn't, we could build big. It's, we will be here when the sky returns. We will remember, together. Carry that patience with you as we climb again into thin air. South, high above a blue, cold lake in Peru, stone towers stand in ranks like sentinels, cylinders of fitted blocks tapered against earthquakes and time. They held the dead and the living's promises, and they look out over water that has kept its own counsels for millennia. At Silistani, masonry becomes a circle that breathes, and burial becomes an engineering problem solved with elegance. The road to Silistani climbs through air so thin it turns your breath into a counting device. The altiplano spreads in a hard, blue light, the land flat as a held palm, the sky so near it feels like another surface you could touch. Then Lake Umeo appears, nearly round, improbably calm, a mirror set into volcanic rock. On a peninsula that reaches into that mirror stand the chulpas, stone towers in ranks and clusters, cylinders built for the dead and engineered for the living's peace of mind. From a distance they read as punctuation marks on a high sentence. Up close they are arguments about how to make time behave. No two are quite the same. Some are low and thick, others loft to nearly 12 meters, the tallest of them tapering inward by a degree you feel before you measure it. That slight batter, learned by anyone who has asked dry stone to stand tall in an earthquake country, gives each tower a stance. The finest examples wear tight ashlar, smoothed blocks fitted in courses so sharp the shadows inside the joints look intentional. You can trace the mason's pride with a finger, drafted margins where a face was squared, faint pecking where a surface was tamed, the bevel too subtle to notice until the late light catches it. Other towers are rougher, their skins built of smaller stones around a rubble core, the difference likely as much about chronology and workshop as about budget, a Kala tower here, an Inca-era completion there, the styles in conversation on the same ridge. Walk a circle around one and you find the practical grace notes, a small trapezoidal opening, often to the east, towards sunrise, no larger than a shoulder and sometimes smaller. It looks like a vent but behaves like a key. The living would pass funerary bundles through it, or offerings later, air could circulate, light could find the dead at the right hour on the right days. Inside, the chamber is cooler than the wind and smells of stone. Niches in the wall wait like open hands. In some towers the interior is lined with smaller, careful blocks, in others the outer finery gives way to an honest core that did not need to impress because it would never see the sun. An engineer would nod at the ordering, beauty where it stages a ritual, brute strength where it must hold the weight. These were not cenotaphs. When archaeologists opened some of the chulpas, they found what the local Aymara and Quechua memory had long said lived there, mummies wrapped and placed in fetal positions, goods around them as if a journey were real and upcoming, pottery, textiles, foods, small ornaments. The towers acted as both tomb and household. Lineage lived here in a literal way, the dead were present, visitable, part of the calendar of obligation and pride. A community could climb to the towers with offerings when the year or a family date said to, pass gifts through the east mouth, and speak names into stone. The architecture is a technology for keeping the dead proximate without letting weather ruin them or wild animals make scandal of the bones. Silistani's precision has a composure that takes a minute to register. The best towers are not simply tall, they are true. Courses run level with a stubbornness that makes the surrounding landscape look drunk by comparison. Where a block meets its neighbor, the fit is so forgiving of time that the joint still looks new when the face is old. Some chulpas wear shallow reliefs, animals that mean water and life in this dry highland, small lizards, perhaps, or serpents, their bodies like cursive on the stone. Whether they were there from the first day or carved after the tower had already lived a while, they do the same work. They remind a passerby that in a place of bright cold and thin burning sun, water is wealth. From the towers you can see the lake shimmer like an argument already won. The Kala people steward this peninsula before the Inca incorporated them and their places into a larger imperial order. You can read that history in the stone grammar. Some towers are all Kala, round, thick, competent, a little blunt. Some show the Inca hand in the crispness of the joints, in the preference for regular courses and the trapezoid opening shaved clean. A few sit unfinished like a teacher's sketch, faces half-dressed, bosses left proud where levers once bit, a course asking for the next one that never came. Those half-made towers are generous. They show the sequence, how a base is laid with stones big enough to frighten, how the wall climbs in rings with a slight inward persuasion, how scaffolds must have leaned where the experts needed to reach, how a skin of care hides an honest belly of fill. You can stand before an unfinished chulpa and feel something all monuments conceal, the hours. Legends here speak of Gentiles, the ancient ones, giants, sometimes, or just a people not quite like us who raised towers quickly and then were undone. You hear this story on other continents and other ridges, too. Giants is how descendants translate the sight of 100 bodies pulling a sledge, or 1,000 baskets of fill lifted against a cold wind. It is how coordination looks to a single pair of eyes. Another set of stories tells flood. On the Altiplano, the lakes are old, the shorelines tattooed into the hills in faint rings like tree growth hidden in bark. People notice when the water rises above cheap talk and takes houses, they remember when it withdraws and leaves fish in the grass. Asking whether a particular flood explains a particular ruin is not always the right question. The better question might be, in a place where water level has moods, how do you build to make memory and honor survive them? The Chulpas answer partly by geometry, partly by siting. They choose rock spines and peninsulas that see far, ground that drains. They go round so that earthquakes do not find corners to pry apart. They batter inward so that the wall's own weight pushes it toward itself rather than away. They wake to east so that ritual has a direction. Inside, some have small vents besides the east mouth, a way to let damp out, the tower breathing very slowly. When storms roll across Umeå in the dry season like arguments out of the west and the rain falls in coarse grains, the towers do something rare, they look untroubled without looking indifferent. They bear. Silastani is not shy about the dead, but it is not morbid. On a bright day the towers throw shadows like sundial hands that move too slowly for us to notice. On a cold evening they hold back the wind with a competence you start to envy. People come to walk between them and talk in tones that match the place, the way we modulate our voice in churches without deciding to. Elders lean on canes and name hills and ancestors. Children run along the base course until a parent calls and the run resolves into a respectful walk. The towers accept both, as long as you do not climb where you should not. These are not perfect objects. Time has stolen blocks from some and tucked them into modern fences and sheds down in villages where stone is always short. Lightning looks for the highest thing and finds towers before it finds tourists. You can see where a strike has jumped edges and left the faint carbon taste of sulfur in the nose. Earthquakes remind even cylinders to mind their posture, and when one goes ill a crack can widen until the whole stack must pause before gravity's last word. And yet there are more intact towers here than you would expect on a windswept ridge at 3,800 meters. That is partly luck, mostly design, and a little community, because places that matter get repaired even when the repair is quiet and pragmatic rather than ceremonious. Stand where you can see the lake and 3 towers at once. Think about what the builders were aiming at besides dignity. Ancestors in earthen cities like Cahokia needed continuity. Ancestors in stone like Baalbek needed permanence, ancestors here needed both in a climate that punishes laziness. Chulpas make a sensible compromise, modular, reparable, conspicuous enough to gather a clan and humble enough to rebuild after weather breaks them. They are a right someone can learn without a literate priesthood, they are an address that stays valid even when empires change postal systems. We are fond of assigning innovation to the shiny and new. Silastani teaches a less glamorous lesson. You can rediscover the same smart moves in many centuries if the land keeps setting you similar exams. Trapezoids behave better than rectangles when the ground moves, slight taper keeps pride from collapsing, vents manage damp, east keeps people punctual for the dawn. These are truths that don't require a library, only attention. When the sun begins to drop, the lake turns metallic and inhospitable and then, for 5 minutes, friendly again. The towers go from brown to gold to a color without a name. The air cools so quickly your teeth think of soup. You walk down with small stones in your shoes and the sense that engineering, when it is honest, is a kind of care. Care for the dead, for the living, for the climate's rudeness, for the land's old habits. The chulpas will be here in the morning catching the first thin light through their small mouths. The lake will pretend to be a mirror again until the wind remembers its ancestry. Our route now folds into a different kind of chamber, one cut not for the sky but out of the earth itself. Under farmland in eastern China, entire rooms have been carved from rock and left unmentioned in the chronicles that name everything else. Tool marks run like music staves along their walls, pillars rise from bedrock to hold ceilings that have not fallen, and air speaks in echoes that feel calculated. If Silistani is a circle of stone learning to breathe, the Long Yu caves are breath-held, and held for reasons nobody wrote down. Legends here speak of Gentiles, the ancient ones, giants, sometimes, or just a people not quite like us who raised towers quickly and then were undone. You hear this story on other continents and other ridges, too. Giants is how descendants translate the sight of 100 bodies pulling a sledge, or 1,000 baskets of fill lifted against a cold wind. It is how coordination looks to a single pair of eyes. Another set of stories tells flood. On the Altiplano, the lakes are old, the shorelines tattooed into the hills in faint rings like tree growth hidden in bark. People notice when the water rises above cheap talk and takes houses, they remember when it withdraws and leaves fish in the grass. Asking whether a particular flood explains a particular ruin is not always the right question. The better question might be, in a place where water level has moods, how do you build to make memory and honor survive them? The Chulpas answer partly by geometry, partly by siting. They choose rock spines and peninsulas that see far, ground that drains. They go round so that earthquakes do not find corners to pry apart. They batter inward so that the wall's own weight pushes it toward itself rather than away. They wake to east so that ritual has a direction. Inside, some have small vents besides the east mouth, a way to let damp out, the tower breathing very slowly. When storms roll across Umeo in the dry season like arguments out of the west and the rain falls in coarse grains, the towers do something rare, they look untroubled without looking indifferent. They bear. Silistani is not shy about the dead, but it is not morbid. On a bright day the towers throw shadows like sundial hands that move too slowly for us to notice. On a cold evening they hold back the wind with a competence you start to envy. People come to walk between them and talk in tones that match the place, the way we modulate our voice in churches without deciding to. Elders lean on canes and name hills and ancestors. Children run along the base course until a parent calls and the run resolves into a respectful walk. The towers accept both, as long as you do not climb where you should not. These are not perfect objects. Time has stolen blocks from some and tucked them into modern fences and sheds down in villages where stone is always short. Lightning looks for the highest thing and finds towers before it finds tourists. You can see where a strike has jumped edges and left the faint carbon taste of sulfur in the nose. Earthquakes remind even cylinders to mind their posture, and when one goes ill a crack can widen until the whole stack must pause before gravity's last word. And yet there are more intact towers here than you would expect on a windswept ridge at 3,800 meters. That is partly luck, mostly design, and a little community, because places that matter get repaired even when the repair is quiet and pragmatic rather than ceremonious. Stand where you can see the lake and 3 towers at once. Think about what the builders were aiming at besides dignity. Ancestors in earthen cities like Cahokia needed continuity. Ancestors in stone like Baalbek needed permanence, ancestors here needed both in a climate that punishes laziness. Chulpas make a sensible compromise, modular, reparable, conspicuous enough to gather a clan and humble enough to rebuild after weather breaks them. They are a right someone can learn without a literate priesthood, they are an address that stays valid even when empires change postal systems. We are fond of assigning innovation to the shiny and new. Silistani teaches a less glamorous lesson. You can rediscover the same smart moves in many centuries if the land keeps setting you similar exams. Trapezoids behave better than rectangles when the ground moves, slight taper keeps pride from collapsing, vents manage damp, east keeps people punctual for the dawn. These are truths that don't require a library, only attention. When the sun begins to drop, the lake turns metallic and inhospitable and then, for 5 minutes, friendly again. The towers go from brown to gold to a color without a name. The air cools so quickly your teeth think of soup. You walk down with small stones in your shoes and the sense that engineering, when it is honest, is a kind of care. Care for the dead, for the living, for the climate's rudeness, for the land's old habits. The chulpas will be here in the morning catching the first thin light through their small mouths. The lake will pretend to be a mirror again until the wind remembers its ancestry. Our route now folds into a different kind of chamber, one cut not for the sky but out of the earth itself. Under farmland in eastern China, entire rooms have been carved from rock and left unmentioned in the chronicles that name everything else. Tool marks run like music staves along their walls, pillars rise from bedrock to hold ceilings that have not fallen, and air speaks in echoes that feel calculated. If Silistani is a circle of stone learning to breathe, the Long Yu caves are breath-held, and held for reasons nobody wrote down. Comparisons help because they also mislead in healthy ways. China knows rock-cut architecture, grottos whose walls are crowded with Buddhas and bodhisattvas, galleries where paint still sleeps under soot. Long Yu is not that. It has no narrative carved where we can see it. Its beauty is in geometry and the stubborn politeness of the grooves. Think, instead, of underground quarries in other parts of the world, stone taken from ceilings rather than floors, pillars sculpted to be square because the block that would have been quarried there was spared to keep the roof. Longyo's pillars are not all square, angles soften in places, the rooms choose oddities of plan that look like the rock's idea as much as a surveyor's. That hybrid, plan negotiated with bedrock, gives the place its personality. It was not cut against geology so much as in conversation with it. Walk a chamber's perimeter and you start to collect tiny consistencies. Corners are eased so they will not propagate cracks, pillar faces carry the same tool width for long runs before, suddenly, they don't, the floor drains toward the entrance in a manner too persistent to be coincidence. If storage ever happened here, someone cared about moisture and mold. If ceremony happened, someone cared about arrivals, the procession inward and the reversal outward that preserves a mood. A complex built by hundreds tends to leave a rhythm in the details even when its name does not. Stand under a ceiling and think about scaffolds. Think about ropes and pulleys, about a foreman with a charcoal line on the wall marking, "Do not go past here," until the supporting block below has learned to be a pillar. Think of how the last day of cutting the last floor course would feel, the way the room would stop being a job and become a climate. The villagers who drained the ponds and found stairs felt a version of that shock. The earth had been working on a secret grammar beneath their fields, and the water had been the censor that kept it hidden. When the censor withdrew, the sentence declared itself. It is a delicate thing to keep wonder without breeding credulity. These caves do not need impossible tools to be astonishing. They do not require creatures not human to have built them. They require an appetite for organization, an intimacy with stone, and a culture that could ask many hands to do work for reasons those hands agreed to. Whether those reasons were profit, ritual, safety, or all three will keep people writing papers for a long time. Meanwhile the caves stand in their cool and agree to be visited in small numbers, their tool marks catching sidelight like writing on an old slate. When you climb back out and the farmland resumes its business, scooters on roads the width of a cart, ducks in a ditch rehearsing historical insults, the absence of a neat label for what you've seen is the presence of something else. We are not owed a paragraph in a chronicle for every greatness. The land is full of deliberate silences. Long Yu is one. It stores skill the way a body stores a melody heard long ago, more felt than named, instantly known when you hear it again. From here we'll go as far as a map allows without falling off the page, a volcanic island turning its face to an empty Pacific, where stone people watched the land from platforms like prayer mats. The hands that carved them found a way to make ancestors stand, then learned the cost of maintaining that conversation when forest and soil answered back. On Rapa Nui, the Moai keep their gaze and their mystery both, and the story turns from moving stone to moving a society. On a map of the Pacific, Rapa Nui is a pinprick so far from neighbors it feels like a rumor the ocean kept. You reach it and the rumor resolves into wind over grass, low volcanic cones, a coastline gnawed into terraces of black rock, and faces, tall, impassive, everywhere. Nearly 900 of them, carved from the tuff of the Reno Raraku quarry and set upon stone platforms called ahu like elders in a long council. Most stand with their backs to the sea and their gazes turned inland, toward gardens and houses, toward the descendants they were meant to guard. Their features are family, heavy brows, long noses, firm mouths cut with an economy that reads as authority. Once, many had eyes, coral sclera with dark stone pupils, that changed the whole figure's voltage when set in place. The effect, if you have seen a restored example, is not subtle. The island looks back. The statistics don't diminish them. Many moai cluster around 4 meters in height, 12 to 13 tons of stone coaxed from the quarry's slopes and marched across lava fields where a boot sole finds no mercy. A few are larger. One unfinished giant, still fused to the bed at Reno Raraku, stretches to something like 21 meters, a colossus the island never asked the winds to test. On the heads of several completed figures sit red scoria topknots, pukeo, from a separate quarry at Puna Pau, the color like a ceremonial shout. The ahu platforms are not mere plinths. They are carefully engineered terraces of fitted stone, seawalls and ramps and pavements, sacred stages where lineage and landscape meet under a sky that prefers drama. The used-to-be impossible question, how did they move, still slips the mind into wonder. The tuff is relatively soft under a chisel but stone under a shoulder. Rapa Nui's trees were not generous in the centuries leading to contact. Indeed, the island lost its great palms over time. The old image of armies of rollers eating the forest down to mud is neat and unsatisfying, though. Local oral tradition has its own explanation. Mana, the spiritual potency that chiefs and priests could marshal, made the statues walk. Modern experiments have, in their worldly way, honored that explanation. With ropes and teams at either side, an upright replica can be rocked and inched forward, heel to toe, in a gait that reads as choreography rather than drag. Sledges and rails remain possible in places. The island is not a single terrain and people are not a single method. What the experiments confirm is less a single technique than a principle. Intelligence plus rhythm converts mass into compliance. On the way, mana acquires another meaning, the power a community makes when it moves together. Reno Raraku is the place to understand both the craft and the heartbreak. Statues stand their waist deep in soil on the crater's flanks like chess pieces waiting for a player who never returned. Others lie face down, half detached. Dozens remain in the rock like negatives. You can see the production line's logic, bodies sketched horizontally, backs freed, the whole figure slid down the slope for finishing and erection. You can also see a long interruption. When the island's historical weather turned and politics thickened, projects stalled where they stood. The quarry became a calendar of plans deferred. What the moai were for is less contested than how they walked. Ancestors, yes, but not simply memorials. They are embodiments of presence, ariki and other high-ranking dead transfigured into stone that could witness and bless. The ahu served as tombs as well as stages, bones interred behind or within their walls, offerings brought the dead into the living year. When eyes were set, the statues awoke. The inland gaze was not indifference to the sea but devotion to the community that had obligations to it. One platform is famous for facing outward, Ahu Akivi, with a small cohort of moai looking seaward as if minding a horizon, but the norm is to look across fields and houses, a watchfulness measured in generations. There is a second question, thornier and easier to ask than to answer. What happened? The short, satisfying story, people cut trees for rollers, soil eroded, agriculture failed, society collapsed, statues fell, is tidy enough for a bumper sticker. The longer story is messier and more human. The palms indeed vanished, but rats that arrived with canoes may have nibbled seeds faster than forests could renew. Climate variability added stress. People made gardens in rock mulch to conserve moisture and slow wind. Ingenuity answered as long as it could. Then strangers arrived. Peruvian slavers in the 1860s kidnapped a significant portion of the population into mines and guano pits. Diseases followed. Later, missionary regimes rearranged life and space with a conqueror's certainty. Many moai were toppled, but evidence suggests much of that toppling is post-contact, civil conflict amplified by shocks from abroad, storms of human origin layered atop the island's own weather. To say, collapse, without naming those centuries is to leave out the heaviest stones. Even the sea joined in the vandalism more recently. A great earthquake off Chile in 1960 sent tsunamis across the Pacific. On Rapa Nui, walls and platforms were damaged, reminders that the island's exposure is not only a metaphor. Local memory keeps an older inventory of waves, too, stories of water arriving higher than it should, taking things it had no right to. On a coast that keeps what it can and erases the rest, a platform is both a prayer and a dare. In the faces there is no panic. That is part of what disturbs and consoles. You stand before a row on an ahu at dusk and the wind flattens the grass and the light makes all the noses cut like sails. They do not tell you their dates or the years they fell. They seem to inhabit a different contract with time, one where watching is itself a kind of work. You begin to notice the small variations that mark hands and families, a tightness around the mouth here, a slightly different angle to the brow there, the hint of a chin that departs from the standard. Standardization is a technology. So is departure. Both are visible along a single platform's lineup when you look long enough. Some moai, resurrected after conservation, wear their eyes again. The first time you see that, coral bright as a gull's wing, pupils dark and steady, you feel the statues pass from object to subject. They are not looking at you, exactly. They are looking through you, as if something behind your shoulder requires their attention more. It's an unnerving kindness. It suggests that even now, folded into a heritage economy of flights and tour vans and guidebooks, the island's oldest agreement persists: ancestors are present and the living have obligations to behave as if watched. Rapa Nui's present is not a museum stuck open at one chapter. People are here, speaking Rapa Nui and Spanish, carving again, guarding sites with a zeal that feels like a reply to centuries of being treated as somebody else's puzzle. Conservation is a daily argument with salt and wind, the science is careful, the community more so. The island's story is being retold, in classrooms, in courtrooms, on carved wood and new stone, so the verbs shift from passive to active. Not "we're moved," but "we moved." Not "collapsed," but "were assaulted and endured." Stand a last time with the ocean at your back and the statues turned inland. Imagine a night when a team, with ropes and chants, made a new ancestor walk. The route would have been cleared, the ground marked, the caller's voice measured out on breath. The figure would sway, check, sway, stone impersonating stride, until the ahu received it, and then a day would come when eyes were set and the village brought food and the dead and the living shared an hour the wind could not erase. That is the story the island's faces true to inland still tell, that a small community at the end of the world can make a covenant with itself so strong it leaves a weather in stone. From this remote council of watchers we turn inland again and far back in time, to a hill in southeastern Turkey where pillars older than most of agriculture rise in circles and carry animals across their faces. There, at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, ceremony seems to have come first and settlement second, and a congregation of stones was carefully buried as if put to sleep. If Rapa Nui makes the ancestor stand, that plateau makes the world begin. The hill is modest, the way thresholds often are. From a distance Göbekli Tepe looks like a swell of earth that forgot to finish being a mountain. Up close, the ground resolves into circles of cut limestone half sunk into time, T-shaped pillars rising from shallow enclosures, some almost twice the height of a person, their shoulders squared like stylized torsos, their faces kept deliberately blank. The skin of these stones is not empty. Foxes run there. Vultures pick at air. Snakes coil, boars lean, cranes step with the odd dignity only cranes achieve. Carvings crowd and arrange themselves like sentences in a script whose grammar we can feel but not speak. Reach out and your palm reads a craft practiced until it grew quiet, low relief cut with a steadiness that suggests both ritual and repetition. The dates rattle expectation. These circles were raised nearly 12,000 years ago, at a hinge of climate when ice surrendered its claims and the world relearned its coastlines. That makes the place older than stone circles in Britain by something like 7 millennia, older than Egypt's big ambitions by even more. What unsettles the mind most is the order of operations. Here, ceremony seems to have led settlement rather than the other way around. Bone and flint and feasting traces litter the fills, but there is little of the domestic, no hearths that feel like home, no floors worn by daily feet. It looks like a rendezvous more than a village, a high place where dispersed groups agreed to agree for reasons we would recognize, to remember, to bargain, to ask the sky to keep its end of things. Once you have Göbekli in your eyes, nearby sites stop being separate curiosities and become a chorus. East lies Karahan-Tepe, with pillars shouldering out of the earth in numbers that make you reconsider what isolated means, a stone-cut hall, their cradles heads carved in the round as if the T-pillars' abstract bodies had been given faces and then set aside. Earlier still in excavation history, Navali Kori introduced archaeologists to this family of T-shapes, a rehearsal for the melody that Göbekli would make famous. Whatever we call this, tradition, horizon, culture, it rippled across the uplands, sharing a toolkit of ideas, pillars as stylized beings, animal reliefs as a bestiary of meaning, enclosures as theaters for choreographed attention. You can draw a map in your head that connects hill to hill the way footpaths once did. There are speculative temptations in the imagery, and we should let them knock at the door without letting them move in. The handbag shape some see, rectangles with arched handles held by stylized figures, does recur in other times and places. So do serpents, so do birds that manage both death and sky. It is a small step from noticing rhymes to proposing a single voice, a global memory that survived a catastrophe and scattered its symbols like seeds. But small steps can still be leaps. Human minds have a limited store of shapes they return to when talking about certain kinds of power, the bag that carries, the snake that sheds and returns, the vulture that mediates between carrion and cloud. Convergence is not a defeat for wonder. It is evidence that different coasts, valleys, and hills solved the problem of expressing all with a similar visual mathematics. The engineering here is its own argument for care. These circles are not piles. Pillars sit in carved sockets, benches run along enclosure walls, mortise and tenon joins lock horizontals to uprights, fittings hide where only the builders and the animals on the stones would have known them. And then, after generations of use, something rarer happened. People buried the very circles they had raised, backfilling them with debris and broken sculptures as if tucking the places into a deliberate sleep. The act preserved the carvings the way ash preserves fresco, out of sight, safe from weather and theft, waiting for a century that would arrive with trowels and arguments. Why bury? Explanations range from the practical, retiring a tired structure, to the ceremonial, closing a shrine properly, to the political, ending one kind of gathering as another replaced it. The fill is more than rubble, it is an archive of a decision. If the circles are a lens, the background they focus is water. Between roughly 10 and 5,000 years before our calendar's year zero, seas rose, sometimes on a human timescale that felt like a rumor turning into a door. Meltwater pulses walked shorelines inland, river mouths redrew themselves, bays learned new names. That rise did not happen everywhere at once nor to the same song, but the chorus was global. If dozens of later cultures remember a flood that reset their terms with the world, the ground truth behind those stories is not thin. Still, flood is a coat that fits many climates. A cataclysm in one basin becomes a universal in the way stories travel. 100 smaller drownings over centuries become, in memory, a single enormous sea that came too far. The question worth asking is less, was there one flood to explain them all, and more, how did water's long insistence shape where people met, what they built, and what they chose to spend attention on? Under modern waves, the hints multiply and argue. Off Yonaguni in Japan, stairs and terraces stride down under blue water with a geometry that seduces the eye and splits the room, some seeing quarry and platform, some seeing natural jointing and the ocean's tidy chisel, many suspecting a partnership of both. Off India's western coast, divers and sonar have sketched structures off the modern city of Dwarka. Periods, materials, and meanings keep their caution hats on, but the possibility of older shorelines carrying human order is not a fantasy. In shallow seas the world over, fishermen snag nets on rectilinear anger. Every such snag is not a city. Some are. Or might be. The point is less to decide from the boat deck than to admit that our maps of the deep shelf are as young as our satellites, and our ideas of where people lived 12,000 years ago still lean too hard on modern shorelines. By the time you climb back out of Göbekli's trenches and let the plateau wind salt your lips, the neat narratives will have misbehaved on you. The desire to crown a single, lost global civilization is an understandable impatience with the mess of history, but it robs the living past of its most impressive talent, the ability of many different groups to arrive independently at forms that answer the same riddles: gravity, weather, hunger, belonging, the need to turn the sky into a calendar and the dead into companions. If there were long networks of contact in deep prehistory, they would have looked like the networks we know, local threads braided into regional cords, carried by traders, lovers, captives, pilgrims, and the stubbornly curious. If some signals traveled farther, motifs, tricks of joinery, ways to hold a year inside a wall, that is a human triumph, not a conspiracy begging for a single author. What unites the places we have walked is not a blueprint but an ethic. Precision, when people mean it, is an act of love. To fit stones until no blade of grass can pry between them is to say, this matters. To align a passage so that one winter sunrise in 100 storms lands exactly where the elders promised it would is to say, we keep our appointments. To raise a pillar and then bury it when its work is done is to say, we know how to close as carefully as we opened. Whether the material is limestone, basalt, earth, or tuff, whether the tool is a sled, a lever, a rope, a chant, or a season of shared labor, the through line is attention, organized and sustained. The flood stories we met along the way do not ask for less attention. They are not footnotes to engineering, they are the climate of meaning in which engineering happens. Communities who suspect the world can be unmade in a season build to be remembered. They write with light and mass because ink fails in water. They embed instruction in ritual so that when the river takes the fields or the sea eats a harbor, the knowledge of how to begin again has a place to sleep. The people at Göbekli hauled pillars uphill not because they were naive about physics but because they were professionals of memory. If you can gather strangers around a circle of stone and give them a job only togetherness can solve, you have invented society again. When we leave the hill, it is with better questions than we arrived with. Not, who were the giants, but, how many shoulders make a giant's work? Not, which flood, but, how does a people shelter its calendar against water's moods? Not, was there one civilization, but, how did many make their thoughts rhyme across mountains and seas? The answers will change as spades turn soil and sensors scan seabeds. That is not a problem, it is the privilege of living in a time when ruins still have news for us. What does not change is the way these places behave on the body. A seam that won't admit a blade makes you calmer about what patience can do. A sunbeam that finds a chamber after the longest night makes you braver about return. A row of stone faces watching inland makes you tender toward promises that take a lifetime to keep. A circle of buried pillars tells you that endings can be acts of care. Across deserts, jungles, plains, ridges, and coasts, the old agreements stand in the weather and whisper, in a language made of shade and light and weight, that we are not the first to be clever, not the first to be frightened, and not the first to decide that meaning deserves a monument. Stop watching for a moment. Listen. The wind over stone keeps its ledger. The pages turn slowly. We have only read a few. There are more under the sand, under the forest, under the sea, and, most faithfully, under our habits of attention. If we keep those habits sharp, the old builders will continue to tutor us in how to be new.